A bright flash appeared in the air, and because of this attack, several dragons, being wounded, began to fall down, surrounded by a weak magical aura that remained around them after the attack hit them. This battle took place near the last fortress of humanity in the gloomy city, and explosions and flashes of magical energy appeared in the air every now and then, and bloody dragons, falling to the ground, destroyed the remaining buildings. One of the most powerful attacks, hitting the largest dragon, struck this, and the monster twitched, roared, and the elder, frowning in excitement, said that even the almighty dragon died. The guardian of time Yahello, who came out of the portal, came closer to him and seriously warned that their world can no longer be saved. The elder turned towards him, and Yahello, kneeling before him, exclaimed that he was ready to burn his body and soul with the time dragon in order to open a path to the past for the elder. He asked him not to lose hope and give the new generation a chance to live, and with a determined frown, he also admitted that he believed that the elder would be able to change the future. He placed his palm on his chest, and the elder, closing his eyes, said that he was one of those who had the best control over the data of time, because he had always watched this place. They all belonged to this time, and he understood that none of them could leave this world. He lightly struck the ground with the end of his staff, and the magical energy that was released formed a magic circle under the end of it, and also began to rise into the air, swirling in a spiral around the elder. From this energy, magical books also appeared in the air, and he, frowning in concentration, raised his staff, simultaneously waving his other hand, and only strengthened the flow of magical energy emanating from it. Soon this energy turned into a shining book, and holding it in his palm, the elder said that he who does not belong to this time must rewrite the fate of mankind. Sharply sticking his staff up, he directed it towards the beam of magical energy, the beginning of which was surrounded by several magical circles, and along with this beam of light, the magical book also went up. Gradually, the number of magical circles increased, the beam of light divided into several parts that twisted into a spiral, rushing upward, and when the magic flew high enough, the eyes of a monster suddenly shone in the sky, which, grinning, called people weak and said that this useless struggle makes them even more pitiful. Having come forward, the monster became more visible, and extended its tentacles towards the beam of magical energy to stop it. Yahello, noticing the monster, frowned in recognition, and confirming his guess, the elder exclaimed that it was the Forbidden God. The Forbidden God, meanwhile, continuing to entangle the magical energy with its tentacles, said that all the pitiful hopes of the people would be swallowed up by despair, and while the Forbidden God was saying this, the people who were still alive and hearing it realized that it wanted to destroy the passage. The monster continued to speak, declaring that they had become humanity, wasting centuries on ruins, and said that with this sad hope, they would turn to dust. The elder, closing his eyes, stood for a while, concentrating, but after that, he raised his hand with the staff, and although he admitted that they could be nothing but dust, he said that they would die as heroes. Addressing the Forbidden God, he said for it to see their final fury, and small particles of magical energy began to separate from his body into the air. Yahello, standing next to him, put his hand to his chest, closing his eyes, and energy began to be released from his body as well. Some knights, standing a little to the side, frowned in confusion, noticing this, and began to ask what was this? One of them realized that this was being done by the Holy Elder, noting that he was performing a ritual of sacrifice. The elder, meanwhile, shouted that their age was coming to an end and soon they would all perish, and turning to the faithful warriors, he invited them to join this great fireworks of the Day of Judgment. The knights, closing their eyes, stood up, repeating the actions of the elder, and decided that they would follow him and die without regrets. A tear ran down the cheek of one of the warriors, but he also closed his eyes, giving up his energy, and thanks to what these warriors, the elder and Yahello did, the passage created before became brighter and more powerful, and the Forbidden God cried out desperately, trying to deny what was happening. They, the people of antiquity, meanwhile thought that they were giving a gift to the people of the future, noting that it would pass through the Milky Way and make a long journey into the past in order to sow the seeds of hope for the future of humanity. The passage they created, breaking through the Forbidden God, rushed into space, flying between the stars, and the warriors thought that this would be the generation of the ancient wasteland, where beasts and monsters rage. They imagined the people who were subject to dragons, and declared that having tamers, these people would fight monsters and obtain the best resources. They also introduced several people surrounded by terrifying monsters, noting that outside the shelter, there would be many dangerous bloodthirsty monsters waiting for them, where death awaited them at every turn. The Blacklight main base had been standing in the dangerous wasteland for hundreds of years, and the current owner of it was an extremely powerful master, and it was he who created a special camp and training method for new tamers. This was the key to the base existing for hundreds of years, and a little later, inside the Blacklight Castle, Soo-Hung walked up to the board, reading the announcement that there was no place for slackers in the Blacklight training camp, and those whose eggs had not hatched within 3 years would be immediately transferred to the gathering team, and if any person had any objections, they would be killed. In addition, the announcement said that training beasts was a risk, and so people were advised to enter the camp with caution. Hung sighed, ran his hand over the large egg he was holding, and sat down on a barrel standing nearby, resting his face on his knees. He didn't understand how this had happened, because tomorrow was the last day, and there were absolutely no signs of hatching. He looked at the egg excitedly, and then, raising his head, cursed mentally, because it was very offensive. And suddenly he noticed a bright flash of light in the sky and, opening his eyes wider, became interested in it, and then, looking closer, noticed that something was flying across the sky at high speed, leaving behind a shining trail of magical energy. Hung even shuddered in surprise and asked himself, "What is it?" The shining object accelerated, approaching him, and finding itself very close to the protagonist, the beam became thinner, and several shining magic circles appeared around it, and the energy, crashing into Heng's forehead, began to be absorbed into his head. He shuddered in surprise, unable to hold on to the barrel, and dropped the egg from his hands. The protagonist fell to the ground, losing consciousness, and in his thoughts he saw huge dragons, on whose paws there were huge claws, and huge fangs protruded from their jaws. The dragons were of many different types, and one of them was especially different, as it was larger. But suddenly Hung was distracted from the visions that appeared in his thoughts, as someone began to scream, trying to attract his attention. Opening his eyes, the protagonist heard someone ordering him to wake up. Finally, poking him in the cheek with the handle of the whip, the man repeated the order, shouting for him to get up, and the protagonist shuddered in confusion, looking at the boy, who looked back at him with displeasure, frowning, and asked if he really slept here. There were several other boys standing around, watching what was happening, and continuing his angry speech, the boy declared that the junior disciples could not spend the night in the castle. Hung slightly rose up, looking at him in confusion, and the boy, pointing his whip in his direction, ordered him to answer, and asked if he really slept here. The protagonist frowned in amazement, asking again, and asked himself if it was really just a dream. He remembered the dream in which he tamed a huge dragon, and recreating in his mind himself, as well as the image of the monster standing behind him, he put his palm to his forehead and asked himself, did such monsters really exist? Noticing that he did not react to his words, the guy only got angrier and asked, was Hung really talking to himself? He reminded him that he was here and heard everything, and swinging his whip, he asked, did the protagonist really think that he was an idiot? He hit him sharply, and from this, a small wound appeared on Heng's cheek. Frowning, he opened his mouth in shock, putting his palm to the wound, and the guy, smirking, said that he heard that the protagonist was going to join the wanderers from the search party today and go into the wasteland to get food. He raised his whip again, about to hit him, and asked if he could come back alive by getting out of the tower. Hung frowned, looking at him indignantly, but before anything else could happen, the egg suddenly began to glow faintly, and the top of it cracked, and one of the guys, noticing this, attracted the attention of the protagonist and announced that his egg had cracked. The other guy froze, never striking, and Hung looked at his egg in shock, then asked if he really succeeded. Grabbing the egg, he raised it above his head, kneeling down, and happily shouted that he succeeded, and this all means that 3 years of trying were not in vain and he finally did it. The boy, as well as several of his comrades, shuddered, looking at Hung in horror, and the boy cursed, covering his mouth with his hand, as he realized that the protagonist, whom he called a worthless person, really did everything right. Smiling kindly, he waved his hands, saying that this was just a huge misunderstanding, and when Heng finally got to his feet, he decided that he would definitely inform the head teacher that he had completed the internship and became a master, as he was sure that in the future the protagonist would quickly reach new heights. However, Lu Yu, coming closer, stopped not far from them, said that there was no need to report anything, and Hung and the boy shuddered upon hearing her voice, and turned around, noticing the head mentor of the Blacklight Tower, Yu. She began walking again, stopping in front of Hung, and announced that he would now be able to interact with his egg. He, repeating these words in amazement, pressed his cheek to the egg and closing his eyes called the one who lives inside this, little, admitting that he was waiting for this very much. The egg was slightly irritating, and from inside this one an inarticulate cry was heard, and hearing this, Hung shuddered, smiled happily and said that it was talking. Yu, closing her eyes, also smiled and said that this was wonderful, and then, placing her palms on the shoulders of the main character, said that more and more young tamers were appearing in black light. And suddenly she frowned, becoming more serious, and drew attention to the wound on Heng's cheek and asked what it was. He carefully touched the wound with his hand, and then, pointing towards the guy with his hand, said that it was he who hit him. Angrily looking in his direction, you asked how he dared to hit the master? She crossed her arms seriously, and said that she would give him 20 lashes and then send him out into the wilderness to forage for food, so that he would receive his punishment there. Heng, hearing this, smiled contentedly, and the boy shuddered and, covered in sweat from horror, began to cry, asking you not to do this. Falling to his knees, he extended his hand towards the protagonist, starting to beg him to spare him. But ignoring him, you turned away, telling Heng to follow her, and Heng obeyed. Soon they arrived at the castle and, entering one of the offices in this one, stopped in front of the table where he was sitting. He placed his hands on the table with his elbows and interlaced his fingers with each other, and after that, carefully examining the protagonist, asked if he was really the first newcomer in this semester? He was the master of the base, and you, looking decisively at Heng, who was standing far behind her, smiled, confirming that it was true, and noted that she heard that he was about to join the search party, but suddenly his egg began to hatch. The protagonist smiled proudly, and you added that he should be rewarded well. Heng only became more happy to hear this, and he, happily closing his eyes, called the protagonist a stubborn boy, since he was able to hand over everything at the very last moment. In his opinion, this was not bad, and he said that Heng had two options. Grinning, he announced that the first option was that he could give him a piece of dragon scale, since his beast in this egg was a scaly lizard. He added that this piece would contain high-grade dragon blood, and this would speed up the hatching process. Heng, startled, became more serious, listening intently, and he, pointing a finger in his direction, added that after hatching, the beast would be stronger than other scaly lizards, and in addition, there was a small chance that it would be infected with a drop of dragon blood, causing it to become very strong in the future. In addition, there was a second option, and he announced that when the time came to have a second pet, he would allow Heng to choose one egg from his collection. The protagonist decided that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and with a determined frown, he admitted that he thought he would choose the first option. He was delighted, smiling, and said that he would arrange for the dragon scales to be delivered today during the day, and also, while standing up, he expressed his hope that in the future, Heng would not forget about this and would contribute to blacklight through his efforts. The protagonist lightly hit his chest with his fist and frowned decisively, agreeing with this. Apart from the castle, blacklight itself was divided into two zones, the inner and outer, and the inner zone was where the rich members of the community lived, and it also had a more honest environment. The outer zone, on the other hand, was considered bad and dirty, and was where the lower classes lived. The houses in the outer zone were very different from those outside the gate in the inner zone, and in one of these houses, which belonged to Heng, someone's scream suddenly rang out. The man, noting that he was in pain, asked his interlocutor to let him go, with asking, "What has happened?" Su Qing, who was holding his ear, frowned in displeasure and asked what he knew about pain. Reminding him that he was gone last night, she asked where he was. Heng, closing his eyes, screamed again, noting that he was no longer in pain, and Qing, twisting his ear harder, noted that this morning she went to the inner zone to look for him, but she could not go in, and she had to wait at the gate. She was very worried, and furiously asked what the protagonist even understood. She was going to tear off all his ears, but at that moment, someone suddenly knocked on the door, and continuing to hold Heng by the ear, she turned towards this and asked who was there? The protagonist looked towards the door in surprise, and the guy, entering inside, closed his eyes, resting his palm on his head, and greeted Heng, noting that the owner of the castle ordered this to be delivered to him. He was holding a tray in his hands, on which lay several packages, as well as coins, and bowing, he asked the protagonist to keep it safe. He wished him success in martial arts and raising his beasts, and Qing finally let go of Heng, and after that, they both shuddered in the same way, looking at the items on the tray in shock. Suddenly, Qing smiled enthusiastically and, repeating about raising beasts, asked if the protagonist had really succeeded. She exclaimed that it was very cool, and hugged him, happily closing her eyes. Heng also closed his eyes, and she noted that their mom and dad would be very happy to know that he had succeeded. She understood that they had not sold their previous house in vain, because the protagonist would now become a wet person in society. Heng caught her attention by saying that he would still be living in the outer zone, and Qing suddenly shuddered, noticing that the guy who had brought the money and the scale bundles was still standing at the door, looking at them in shock. They were all silent for a while, exchanging glances, and Ching finally let out a cry, remembering that she was about to go to work. She let go of Hun, who held his neck with his hand, sighing and closing his eyes, as Ching was hugging him too tightly. As she left the house, she told him to behave, announcing that she was leaving, and she waved goodbye to him with a happy smile, and Hun and the other guy froze, watching her. Soon the door closed, and for a while they just stood there, and Hun, closing his eyes, smiled excitedly. After a while, he placed the tray on the table in front of him, frowned in concentration, unpacked one of the boxes, and poured the scales into his palm, asking if this was really a dragon scale. Suddenly, the scales began to emit magical energy, and Hun frowned in confusion, looking at it in amazement, and the magic suddenly moved to his head, and with a start, the protagonist raised his head, and then opened his eyes wider, and in his mind there appeared an image of a shining book, which opened to the desired page, showing a diagram of how a scaly lizard turned into a dragon lizard using the dragon blood root, dragon scales, and hatching an egg and turning the creature into a dragon. Hun opened his mouth, shocked by what he learned, and with a sigh, he thanked the book for this information, and then closed his eyes, lowering his head. Beads of sweat appeared on his face from the tension, and after that, he concentrated on the fact that the scaly lizard could turn into a dragon. He remembered that an adult dragon lizard was a top-class species that could easily destroy a small city. The beast that Hun had was a mid-class species, a scaly lizard, and they were two completely different species. Imagining a terrifying dragon, he frowned as he looked at the egg in the basket next to him, and while mentally recreating the image of the root in question, he held his chin in his hand, recalling that it looked like a brownish-brown root, and asked with interest, was it good for him? He remembered the girl standing next to he, and noted that she was so talented that she eventually surprised the owner of the castle by becoming his apprentice. Looking at the scale still lying on his palm, the protagonist also remembered that the first beast she raised was a high-class dangerous species beast. Frowning determinedly and gritting his teeth, he clenched his hand into a fist, imagining what might happen if he could breed a lizard dragon. He soon ran to the medicine store, and after taking everything he needed, he smiled kindly at the shopkeeper as he gave him the money. After returning home, he ground up the root, thinking that if he could breed a more powerful beast, he too could become the castle master's apprentice. He soon placed the egg in a vessel filled with the ground root, smiling confidently as he watched. Soon after, he drew a magic circle on the ground and used magic to activate it, placing the egg inside, which was still absorbing the ground root. Suddenly, the magical energy spreading from the magic circle began to shine brighter, forming the silhouette of a dragon, and it was so bright that Heng shuddered, squeezing his eyes shut, covering his face with his hand. The dragon's silhouette grew larger and larger, and then it was finally absorbed into the egg, and soon the magic dissipated, and Hun froze, watching the egg in shock, but the next moment he flinched, his mouth wide open, as part of the shell from the very top of the egg flew off. He wondered if the creature inside was still a scaly lizard or if it had already become a dragon lizard. Carelessly frowning, he peered into the egg, and some time later, in the training ground, warriors were training, holding weapons in their hands, fighting. Yu, with her arms crossed over her chest, watched them carefully, tightly pressing her lips and frowning, and suddenly one of the guys, frowning in worry, turned to his partner with whom he was currently fighting, and noticed that Heng's egg had not even hatched yet, and he had not attended training for 4 days. His companion assumed that the protagonist had simply died and laughed, but the boy exclaimed that it was wrong to say that and decided that they should just wait for head teacher Yu to deal with Hun. Suddenly, Yu frowned even more, startled, and noticed that the protagonist had finally arrived at the training plaza. She cried out in surprise and asked if he even realized that he had to attend training. One of the boys frowned in worry, realizing that the protagonist had met his end, and Hun, looking at Yu with a little sadness, said that he had to skip training, but explained that he had a reason for doing so. Smiling, she asked what that reason was. She warned that it would be good if the reason was quite serious, and smiling, Hun turned his head back to see the backpack hanging on his back, and turning to the creature sitting inside, he told it to get out. Lizard, timidly sticking its head out of the backpack, put its paws on the protagonist's shoulder, and then smiled, crying out softly. Everyone who was in the fighting square froze in shock, shuddering when they noticed the dragon, and one of the guys, frowning, said that it was not a scaly lizard. Stuttering, he asked what it was. He called lizard scary, and she threatening clenched her fists, shouting that it was an especially dangerous species of dragon lizard. All the students continued to watch Hung and his pet in amazement, and Yu, stepping aside, said that they should go to the owner of the castle. The protagonist followed her, and soon they came to the office, and he, standing up, slammed his palms on the table, exclaiming that it was indeed a very dangerous species. He asked in amazement, was this the monster that Hung hatched first? He didn't understand what was going on, and pointed his finger at Yu, asking who gave the protagonist this egg. He seriously ordered her to immediately report to the bureau in charge of this, so that they could find this person and fine him 3 months' salary. He didn't understand how they dared to mix a scaly lizard and a dragon lizard to create such an egg, almost depriving this young talent of his future. But suddenly his mood changed, and he smiled as he looked at Hun, noting that as for him, thanks to his work all these years, he had gone through a lot and gained experience. At first, he got a very ordinary scaly lizard egg, and now he already had the most dangerous top-level species, a dragon lizard, in his hands, and this was a great achievement. Besides, despite all his suffering in the past, he was confident that this was just the beginning, and said that Hung would definitely go far. The protagonist smiled, frowning decisively, and put his hand on his chest, promising that he would live up to his expectations. He admitted that he was very glad that they had such a talented and persistent youth in the castle, and suddenly he admitted that he wanted to ask Hung something, and then, pointing his finger in his direction, he asked if he wanted to become his disciple. The protagonist froze, his mouth slightly open in amazement, and asked again, while Lizard, with his eyes closed, rubbed his head against his neck. Yu was also astonished by this proposal and tried to turn to he and say something to him, but fell silent, looking at Hung in amazement, since she did not think that after that genius by Su, he would accept someone else as a disciple. The protagonist, at this point, thought for a moment, but nevertheless exclaimed that he of course really wanted to become his disciple, and confidently frowning, he called him teacher. Lizard smiled, continuing to sit on his shoulder, and he, laughing, agreed with this and stretching out his arms to the sides announced that he would hold a banquet that evening, and all the tamers and their mentors would be there, who, of course, would be free. He proposed to celebrate the appearance of a talented tamer and his disciple, and they celebrated until the evening. Hun and Qing returned home accompanied by his personal guards, being in a carriage, and entering the house. The protagonist told Qing that he was now receiving 100 gold pieces a month for the upkeep of his pet, and asked if she could imagine that this was really so. She suggested in that case that they save up some money and buy back their old house, and also noted that he could then pay for her training. Patting his cheek, she closed her eyes, smiled, and exclaimed that she couldn't earn that much even in 3 years. She was glad that Hun could do it, and he closed his eyes in displeasure and asked her not to pinch him. Soon he walked Qing to her room, telling her to go and rest, as she had to go to work the next day. She agreed, and Hun, sitting at the table next to the lit lamp, picked up a book and read that the most striking difference between ordinary creatures and dangerous species was whether they had the innate ability to use magic. The ability to use magic was called magic talent, and talent was the key factor in determining the strength of a beast. The snake dragon lizard, as one of the most dangerous species, naturally had a special affinity for using magic, and in addition to the most common evil attack, the other 6 skills of the snake dragon were Dragon Sleep, which is able to quickly restore strength and regenerate injuries received in battle. After learning about this, Hung imagined the lizard using it, and read that one of the skills of this is also the lower dragon force, characteristic of most lower dragons, and dragon power. In addition, dragons use the power of the earth, and this was a destructive technique. Another skill, natural force, allowed the use of nature's energy and resources for magic, and the combination of this and dragon sleep made the dragon lizard so tenacious that the power of this increased and it stopped almost invincible. The last skill was an extremely powerful ability that was called evil. It was the most powerful technique, possessing destructive power, and was close to the power of a dragon's breath. Hung put his finger to his chin and frowned in concentration as he read the text and thought about everything he had learned. Finally smiling, he looked at the lizard that was sleeping next to him in the basket and confessed that he believed that it would become a true beast master. Suddenly, the lizard's body drastically increased in size, and it no longer even fit into the basket it had been in before. However, despite the inconvenience, it continued to sleep, while the protagonist shuddered, his eyes wide in surprise, and barely held back a cry. A bead of sweat appeared on his face, and he was very surprised that dangerous dragon species grew very quickly. A little later, when it was already morning outside, Hung sat in the training room opposite he, who, smiling, said that the dragon he now had was truly talented. He suggested that he test its strength in 3 magical elements, and choose one to focus on first. Extending his palm forward, he showed the ring on his finger, and declared that the element of his beast was evil. Looking in shock at the ring that began to exude magical energy, Hung asked in amazement, could this really be his beast talisman? He remembered that a beast talisman was an item that allowed one to keep a beast of enormous size inside oneself, where it could rest and recover. He imagined a girl who stretched out her hand to the side, and from the ornament on her wrist, a dragon emerged. The beast would grow so large that it would be difficult to contain, and so the tamers would often use various ornaments in the form of talismans. Hung also presented several ornaments that could become such a talisman, and in the next moment, he was suddenly distracted as he made his beast come out of the ring. With his mouth slightly open in shock, the protagonist looked at the evil elemental lava wolf that had landed on the floor in front of them. Looking at his pet as well, he announced that it was a representative of the second-tier evil elemental beast, the scarlet wolf. The wolf shuddered slightly as it came closer to he, and he placed his palm on its head and added that this wolf had been his main beast before, noting that it was very suitable for training the snake dragon, as the two beasts matched perfectly together. Hung looked at the wolf with a little fear, wondering if they really matched. He didn't believe it, and the lizard he was holding in his arms also looked scared. He, stroking the wolf's muzzle, said that it was the most dangerous species, combining not only the purebred breed now, but the true animal anger, and it was very harmonious in tandem with Hang's pet. After that, he pointed his finger at Lizard and told the protagonist to put it down on the floor and trust. Hung shuddered in fear, and Lizard reacted in the same way. In the end, the protagonist still listened, putting the dragon on the floor, and it, trembling with fear, looked at the scarlet wolf towering over it. Hung froze in alarm, carefully observing what was happening, and in the end, Lizard, still frightened, clenched his jaws tighter, looking pitifully at the protagonist, who, putting his palms in front of him, told it not to rely on him and act on its own. Pointing his finger forward, he smiled and ordered the scarlet wolf to use evil breath and show the snake dragon how to do it. The monster opened its mouth, and dark magical energy began to accumulate near it. But before the attack was fully formed, someone suddenly ordered the wolf to stop, and it, opening its eyes wider in amazement, froze, dissipating the energy. Small clouds of smoke remained near its mouth, and he, waving his hand, exclaimed that everything worked out. Hum was amazed to hear this, and then frowned in concentration, watching as streams of magical energy appeared around the lizard, and its eyes began to glow menacingly. The lizard frowned, and he looked at it, calling it very clever. Hun, starting to smile, clenched his palms into fists, starting to support his pet and push it into action. The lizard opened its mouth slightly, and the magical energy that had previously simply hovered around it began to contract in order to unite into a single attack in one place. However, when the dragon, closing its eyes, sent an attack forward, only a small cloud of smoke flew out of its mouth, and the protagonist froze, smiling excitedly, but he was pleased, stepping forward a little, and noted that the lizard right now for the first time comprehended the evil element, and explained that this purple smoke is the initial form of the breath of evil thought. After that, he looked at Hun, noting that his dragon really had great talent, and just looking at the first steps of this one can understand that this one has serious potential. The protagonist smiled happily, and he, raising his palm, on which the ring was worn, suggested that the wolf would no longer be useful to Lizard, and when he raised his hand higher, the scarlet wolf disappeared, moving into the ring. Lizard, closing his eyes, sighed with relief, and the next moment another monster appeared behind he, which made the dragon shudder, becoming even more frightened. He, meanwhile, smiling enthusiastically, said that the earthen platypus is a trio formed from earth magic, beast essence, and intimidation. He decided that this platypus should play with the dragon, and the dragon, frightened, ran to Hing, clasping his leg with its front paws. The protagonist shuddered, not expecting this, and his pet, trembling, began to cry, desperately screaming. Hung, looking worriedly at he, asked maybe it was not necessary to do this. He of course admitted that this should be decided by he himself, but still wanted to object, and taking his chin with his hand, he admitted that Hung was right. The platypus disappeared, and instead another monster appeared, drooling from its fangs. The monster waved its powerful tail, and he, smiling, shouted that Hung was of course right, suggesting that this would be too easy, so Lizard needed another beast. He said that the creature he had just summoned was one of his strongest beasts, a harmony of fire, stone and evil, namely a dragon. It was a lava tyrannosaur, and after announcing the name of it, he raised both his hands up, presenting a huge monster that roared, frightening Hung and Lizard even more. They shuddered, their mouths slightly open and their brows furrowed, and looked at the T-Rex in horror. After that, turning his attention back to he, the protagonist asked, "Were dragons really rare?" He smiled and said that he was very lucky that he had hatched a dragon first, as it was an incredible stroke of luck. He guessed that without this dragon, Hung would most likely never have gotten a second egg, and added that many tamers wanted to have such a beast, but could not do so. Hearing these words, the protagonist frowned in confusion, looking at Lizard, who was still clinging to his leg. Thoughtfully holding his chin with his hand, he slightly tilted his head, recalling the shining book he had seen, and guessed that the grimoire of ancient dragons was a very serious thing. Looking at Lizard, he asked, "Is it ready?" The T-Rex opened its eyes wide and looked at its opponent, and Lizard began to tremble, almost crying, but despite this, he extended his hand forward, commanding his lava T-Rex to move forward, and offered to watch the beast's reaction to Hung. The T-Rex, opening its mouth, roared, and from its mouth, streams of powerful wind flew forward, heading towards the protagonist and Lizard standing next to him. They shuddered, frowning, and Hung barely remained on his feet from how strong the gusts of wind were. He put his hands in front of his face, protecting it, and closed his eyes, clenching his jaw, as he noticed the terrifying pressure that was acting on him. He felt like a tiny boat that was about to capsize from this giant, but suddenly he came closer to him and put his hand on his shoulder, and the protagonist shuddered in surprise, frowning. He pulled him aside and advised him to move away, otherwise he might get hurt. Moving away from the attack radius, the protagonist thought with relief that he was lucky, and then opened his eyes wider, looking at the T-Rex with horror, and thought that it was very strong. He, continuing to watch what was happening, attracted Heng's attention, asking him to look too. He turned his attention to Lizard, who, although he closed his eyes and pursed his lips, still stood in place. Crossing his arms over his chest, he said that it was holding up well, and calling out to his T-Rex, he asked that it strengthen the attack. The Tyrannosaur widened its eyes, and then obeyed and roared even louder, and the waves of air spreading from this became stronger. The dragon continued to stand, although its body jerked back a little, and he suggested to see if Lizard could withstand this attack. The protagonist clenched his hands into fists, clenched his jaws and frowned, looking at his pet with confidence, and he suddenly opened his eyes wider, crying out in amazement, as he noticed that the dragon still stood in place. In addition, waves of magical energy began to spread from its body in different directions, and he was amazed that Lizard, although still very weak, was trying to use the lower power of a dragon against the power of a high-level Tyrannosaur. He smiled and placed his hand on his chin, then said that Lizard had a very high level of magical talent, but he admitted that he didn't know if it could break through the terrifying terror of his Tyrannosaurus. Hung shuddered, smiling confidently, and cried out in admiration, asking if Lizard was really that strong? He confirmed it, surprised that it had happened like this, and then, remembering something, he asked if Hung had already used the scales he had sent him? The protagonist said that he had used them as soon as he received them, and holding his chin with his hand, he suggested that the dragon had absorbed the substance in the scales well, and also noted that it might even have been able to obtain some dragon blood, and this helped Lizard double its talent. Hung looked seriously at his dragon, who was still standing despite the attack that was directed towards it, and then he, handing him a book, asked him to take it, explaining that in this book he had collected methods and techniques that would help him in cultivating his beast. Besides that, there was also an interesting method to develop the power of the mind, and he also warned Hung not to forget about his spiritual training when he trained his dragon. The protagonist looked at the book with admiration, and he told him that the power of the mind was his personal power, and also the basis for training the beast. Hung clutched the book to himself with one hand, rested his other hand on his head, closed his eyes and smiled happily, and thanked he for this book and advice. After leaving the castle, he was finally able to buy back his family's old mansion, and since people knew that he had become a master tamer, they treated him with respect. Entering the mansion, Heng began cleaning while Qing worked. He swept the floors with a smile, and after some time had passed, he went outside, looking around the house from the outside. Although he could not make the house as it was in his memories, but there was a feeling of relief in his heart, and before telling Qing the good news, he decided to go to her work and pick her up in order to surprise her. After patting Lizard, who was sitting on his shoulder, he suggested that they go, explaining that they needed to pick up Qing from work. Humming softly, he walked to the right place, and at the same time, several dogs, frowning furiously and opening their mouths threateningly, growled, and Qing, who was the target of the animal's fury, screamed in fear. Hung, hearing and recognizing this voice, turned to the side, frowning, and realizing that it was Qing, he ran forward so fast that Lizard even had difficulty holding on to his shoulder. Qing meanwhile tried to order the animals to move away from her, and Shujin, who was standing next to the dogs, crossed his arms over his chest, smirked and said that he told Qing that his dogs do not bite, calling her beautiful and asking where she was running. His two comrades standing next to him smirked, and the guy, waving his hand, said that these dogs just want to play with Qing. She began waving her hand, closing her eyes, and tried to drive the dogs away from her, and Jin in response only laughed, and then, smirking, promised that his dogs would not play with her if she played with them that evening. His comrades, slightly embarrassed, looked at Qing, and one of them even licked his lips, but suddenly Han, running closer, frowned furiously and asked, "Are they really talking about wanting to play?" He shouted that in that case he would play with the brick and swung the hand that was holding the stone. The boys shuddered and turned around when they heard his voice, and the protagonist ran forward, swung the brick and hit one of the dogs with it. Blood spurted out, the animal, closing its eyes, flew to the side, and Han, quickly moving, stood in front of Qing, covering her with himself and still holding the brick in his hands. The boys trembled, and the protagonist called them street rats, ordering them to stay away from Qing. He continued to frown, asking if Jin really thought that because his father was the owner of the plantation, he could do anything? Meanwhile, the boy looked at his dog, whose name was Charlie, in shock and angry, called Hung names, asking how dare he hit his Charlie? Pointing his finger at the protagonist, he turned to the second dog, Jack, and ordered it to rip Heng's throat out. Jack ran forward, and Hun shuddered, frowning, and noticing that he was still standing in place, Qing looked at him desperately, telling him to run away. But the protagonist continued to stand in place, covering her with himself. Jack at this time was very close to them and jumped up, opening his mouth, ready to injure Hun. He closed his eyes, clenching his jaws, but Lizard suddenly growled, frowning, his eyes shining dangerously, and jumping forward, the dragon sank his teeth into Jack's neck. Blood sprayed into the air. Jack and Lizard flew to the side, and frozen in amazement, Hum looked at the fact that the dragon closed his eyes, still sinking his teeth into Jack's neck. The dog only let out a painful cry, the blood increased, and Hum, smiling, praised Lizard, saying that Jack should finish it off. The dragon jerked, tearing a tuft of flesh from the dog's body, and it froze, dying. Noticing this, Jin screamed desperately. His comrade standing behind him frowned, and he called Hung a name and took out a knife. His friends did the same, and Jin offered to cut the protagonist, and after that he and the other guys ran forward, ordering him to die. Hung shuddered, noticing this, and then, stretching his hand forward, activated the dragon's power, and Lizard, frowning, screamed, and streams of magical energy flew from its mouth in different directions, heading towards the three guys. They froze, trembling, and one of them asked what was going on. One of his friends realized that it was a dragon, and the second suggested that they better get out of here. Suddenly, older men came closer, and Zhang Jun called out to the boys, asking what was going on here. They turned around to look at them, and one of them looked at Jin hopefully, asking him to look at the guards. He asked why they didn't blame it on Qing and Hung. He said that they could ask to be handcuffed, and that would give them time to leave. Jin smirked, putting his hand on his chin, and remembering that he had connections with the police, he agreed to this suggestion, deciding that he would just ask the guards to arrest Hun. Looking at the protagonist, who was still covering Qing with his body, he smirked, imagining what an idiot he would make him look like when he was in a prison cell. Qing's eyes widened as she looked at him in fear, and Jin suddenly felt embarrassed at that look, and thought that when he crippled Hung, he would be meeting Qing right in front of him. Imagining himself grinning as he approached the frightened Qing, he put his hand on his chin, mentally exclaiming that his dogs could not have died in vain. Jun suddenly walked closer to him, crossed his arms, and smiled, asking if that was Jin. Looking at him warily, he asked where he was going. Jin and his comrades shuddered, and then, walking closer to Jun, Jin pointed his finger at Hung, saying that he had killed his dogs with particular cruelty for no reason. He ordered Jun to quickly arrest the protagonist and put him in a cell, and Hung frowned at that accusation. Jun at this time, with a wave of his hand, attracted the attention of two other guards and told them to detain the protagonist. Stepping forward, one of them, clutching handcuffs in his hands, asked how Hing dared to touch Jin's dogs. He told him to be a good boy now, and promised that they would not hurt him. Hung suddenly threw a brick right at the feet of the guards and seriously announced that he had killed the dogs with this brick, telling them to just ask something from this one if they had nothing better to do. Qing clung to him fearfully, And one of the guards, angry, asked how Hung dared to kill dogs, and in the middle of the street at that. He said that he would definitely like it in the cell, but suddenly the dragon climbed onto the protagonist's shoulder, and noticing this, the guards shuddered, and their rage disappeared. The dragon, on the contrary, frowned angrily, looking at them menacingly, and frowning in fear, the guards simultaneously asked, "Is Hung a tamer?" The protagonist added that there was something else, and taking out an ID, he showed it to the guards, advising them to open their eyes and look at what it was. On the ID it was written there that he was a tamer, and being even more horrified, the guards realized what it was. June also shuddered, while his charges, covered in sweat from excitement, turned towards him, attracting his attention. Sweat appeared on June's face too, and he thought that recently there were rumors in their database about a second disciple of he. He was amazed that this disciple was Hung, and taking out a gun, he fired several times into the air, and asked, "What kind of impudence is this?" Pointing his gun at Jin and his friends, he asked how he had the audacity and arrogance to stage this murder. He ordered his assistants to handcuff them immediately, and if they resisted, he gave permission to shoot them on the spot. Jin asked in amazement, and soon his hands were already cuffed. Not giving up, he got June's attention by shouting in a trembling voice that he was the victim, suggesting that there was some kind of mistake. He said that his father was the owner of the warehouse of Plantation No. 5, and reminded him that his father had done June such a favor, and he was acting like this. Before he could finish speaking, June clenched his jaw and punched him, and the force of the attack even knocked out Jin's tooth. Pointing his finger at the fallen Jin, June turned to his assistants, noting that he tried to escape, so for this he should be beaten with rods. The boys agreed, and began to beat Jin. June, meanwhile, walked up to Hung, smiled and said that no one knew that Jin would set those dogs on them. He admitted that he was glad that the protagonist reacted in time before more terrible things could have happened. Hung chuckled and said that the guards had arrived just in time, and June closed his eyes, smiling even more, trying to deny these words. Then, pointing his hand towards Jin and his comrades sitting on the ground nearby, he said that if these three fell into his hands, then if they did not die, they would flay themselves. He asked if Hung was happy. Frowning seriously, the protagonist said that he was hardly happy, since he would still take revenge on Jin as soon as he was released, and it did not matter whether he died after them or not. Frowning, June said that he understood everything, and the protagonist, suddenly smiling, attracted Qing's attention and asked her to go. She looked away in fear, but he, continuing to smile, said that everything was fine, and announced that they were going home. Qing closed her eyes and smiled in agreement, exclaiming that they were going home. June, watching Qing and Hung walk away, turned to his assistants and asked them what they thought was worse, offending the plantation owner or angering the tamer master. Lao Dong declared that there was no point in even thinking about it, since it was better not to anger the tamers. They were only small people compared to them, and he did not want to die yet. Putting his hand on Dong's shoulder, June noted that he was saying everything correctly, and then told him to look for a carriage for them, and he and the other assistant would wait here and then take the three of them to the chamber, straight to the incinerator. The boys shuddered. Dong said that he would carry out the order, and frowned decisively, and June, threateningly looking at the boys trembling with horror, said that they would keep them near the incinerator, and after that they would do something else. He did not say it out loud, but ran his hand across his throat, showing that this would not bring them any good. Soon Hung and Qing came home, and Qing, screaming in amazement, said that it was very cool, admitting that she never thought that she would return here again. Looking around enthusiastically, she said that she seemed to be in a dream, and the protagonist asked her not to faint, and then, handing her some keys, he said that these were the keys to the house. When she turned in his direction, he added that buying out their old house was only the beginning, because it would be better later. Qing clasped his hand with hers and exclaimed that she believed him, adding that only the best awaited them in the future. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and Hung turned around abruptly upon hearing it. Walking over, he opened the door slightly and asked who was there. Gua smiled kindly and closed his eyes, noting that the protagonist was indeed very forgetful. He said that he was the deputy director of plantation management, and gave his name, and Qing smiled and ran closer and asked why the deputy plantation owner was here. Hung thoughtlessly looked at her with a start, and Gua said that he had just received news from the police that Chu Dingquan's son had offended Hung, and so he was sure that he naturally had to do them a favor. He announced that he planned to transfer Dingquan to Plantation 30 to plow the land and be an ordinary farmer. The protagonist looked at him seriously. Qing was surprised, and Gui continued, noting that although there were wild animals rampant in that place and all sorts of troubles would happen from time to time, but he thought that Ding Quan, who was at least the leader, would be able to adapt to it. After that, he asked for permission to ask and asked if Hung was happy? Holding his chin with his hand, he smiled, admitting that he was glad that the director had paid attention to this. Gua added that he also heard that Ching seemed to be the senior agronomist in their plantation system, and therefore she could be promoted to the position of deputy director in the agronomy department of their department. Ching, looking at Gua in shock, asked again, and then said that she was not at all suitable for this position, and asked if that was true. Gua, with his palms together, exclaimed that she was suitable for them since she was Heng's sister. Besides that, he exclaimed that she could always find him and ask for a favor if she needed anything. Ching happily exclaimed that in that case she would be happy to help, and Gua declared that it meant that everything was decided. The protagonist simply closed his eyes, not knowing how to react to all this, and then, scratching Lizard's cheek with his fingers, he thought that it seemed that as they became stronger, they gained more and more privileges. The dragon simply looked at him in surprise, and after a while, Hung poured the food, surrounded by a magical aura, into the bowl. It was quite a lot, and smiling, the protagonist looked at Lizard, therefore offering to eat another piece, and declared that it was according to his recipe. He added that it was also very good for dragons, because it will eat, grow and become stronger. Lizard was horrified when he saw the food, and then looked at him pitifully, screaming. The protagonist thought at this time that the formulas for tame beast feed were divided into poor quality, average, good, very good, excellent, remarkable, ideal, and perfect. There were only 8 of these types, and the feed that he gave him was of very good quality, just right for a young beast. Hung read all this in the book that he gave him, and mentally added that, besides, this recipe was indeed very important to him as a disciple. However, noticing Lizard's reaction to this feed, he wondered why the dragon did not like it right after it tried the feed. Lizard was still sitting there waving his paw, and closed his eyes so as not to eat it. Hung guessed that it was because of the ingredients, and turned to the side, suddenly noticing a large amount of fish lying on the table. He realized that this was indeed true, recalling what was said in the rituals of the ancient dragons. He frowned, summoning the book, and opened it to the right page, read, "As soon as the dragon lizards hatch, they immediately eat their own shells, and then can go a long time without eating. As a hybrid of 3 species, namely amphibians, dragons and evil, the care of dragons, snakes and lizards cannot be uniform, and it must be focused on certain aspects." At the same time, both dragons and snakes and lizards were quite picky about food and preferred food in the form of living creatures. After reading about this, Hung imagined a dragon eating fish that it caught directly from the river, and finally understood what the problem was, and smiled, and then, patting Lizard on the head, he promised that he would go and look for a new recipe for this. He raised his hand in the air, frowning confidently, shouting that he was giving him a lot of money, so he didn't have to limit the dragon's food, so it should eat more and grow faster. Lizard looked at him enthusiastically delighted. Over the next few days, Hung fed his snake dragon Lizard according to the book of ancient dragon rituals, and when he heard a shopkeeper at one of the small shops announce that the fresh shrimp he had just caught was already on the counter, Hung ran over with his bag ready. A little later, when he returned home, he cut up the fish and made new food with it, noticing that the dragon really liked the new recipe. It really did happily start eating the new food, but it also led to a big problem, and when some time had passed, Hung turned over the bag in which he had money, and almost burst into tears, noticing that only 5 days had passed. Only 1 coin fell out of the bag, which rolled across the floor and fell next to Lizard, who had already increased in size many times. It sat in front of a bowl filled with food, and the protagonist, closing his eyes, still burst into tears, but although there was no money left, his dragon had overcome the baby stage and entered the adult stage. He understood that if they again encountered the dogs, the battle with which then took a lot of strength and energy, then now his dragon would not have any trouble. He crouched down, watching as Lizard began to eat, and imagined it preparing to pounce on the dog, making the leap, slashing at its snout with its claws, and then tearing it to pieces. Imagining Lizard sitting on the dog, Hung mentally noted that it would be able to finish off such a dog in a few seconds with one breath. Besides, with the tough scales that the dragon possessed, an ordinary person with a firearm would pose absolutely no threat, and even if 3 or 5 adult strong men, armed, were to face the snake dragon, it would kill them in a matter of seconds. Thinking about this, he stroked the dragon, but it, unhappy with Hung being distracted, frowned, looking at him menacingly. He simply smiled in response to this, and then suddenly frowned, remembering that he had asked to find him at the castle when the dragon entered its adult stage. However, the surprising thing was that it had only been 5 days since lizards ceased to be a cub. It was possible that the recipes in that old book were indeed for the ideal or perfect level of food, and Hung put his hand to his chin, frowning as he thought about it. He supposed that since that was the case, it was very important to be careful and keep it a secret, and with a determined frown, he clenched his hand into a fist, smiled and exclaimed that it looked like Lizard would soon have to learn how to use its new skills. He noted that it would be a good idea to stop feeding it formula frequently for at least 10 days, but Lizard ignored his words and continued eating. 10 days later, the protagonist came to the castle and stopped in front of one of the doors, knocking on it. Soon, a voice from behind the door asked him to come in, and when the door opened, he noted that he hadn't seen Heng here for a long time, asking if he was lounging around. The protagonist smiled nervously, closed his eyes, grabbed his hair, and apologized to He, explaining that he was working hard to cultivate the dragon, so he was unable to attend training. Opening the door wider, he showed Lizard, who also entered, and noted that thanks to He's recipe, it had successfully reached the second stage. He cried out in surprise, asking, "Did it really happen that quickly?" Hung simply smiled, slightly embarrassed, and then scratched his cheek, as if frowning, noting that growing up in 10 days did not seem that fast. However, after repeating his question, he suddenly became indignant, frowning, and shouted that it took his 8th disciple Su a month for her beast to advance from the baby stage to the adult stage. Running closer to Hung, he hit him on the head, and with his eyes closed, he cried out, pressing his palm to his head. Still frowning furiously, he asked, "How fast does the protagonist still need?" In addition, the Ice Lotus Su was 2 levels lower than the beast dragon Hung, and after saying this, he put his hand on his shoulders, and also raised a finger in an admonishing manner. The protagonist smiled excitedly, sighed, and actually began to think about what would be better without such a wild growth rate. Suddenly, he calmed down, smiling, and noted that Lizard not only had outstanding combat ability, but also had a unique growth potential. He repeated this again, looking at the dragon, and said, "If this is already an adult and is an adult dragon, then it should probably be familiar with its new abilities." Now it had the power of the dragon of the 1st and 2nd degree, and these were 2 kinds of skills, such as the power of the dragon of intimidation and the power of the dragon of shock and awe. He recreated in his mind the images of how the dragon should use these skills, and Heng added that the breath of evil thought also rose to a new level and formed into a stream of evil thought. He looked at him in shock and asked, "Is he really joking?" He was amazed that in such a short time, he was also able to develop dragon skills to such a degree. The protagonist simply smiled embarrassedly, and then, looking at He with delight, exclaimed that all this was thanks to his hard work with him. Closing his eyes, he mentally rejoiced that he had not yet told him about the Master Dragon's sleep, the power of nature, and evil attack. Beads of sweat appeared on his face, but he did not pay attention to his nervousness, and then, turning his back to him, admitted that he did not doubt him, offering to go to his training hall and see what Hung and his dragon were now capable of. The protagonist happily agreed, and soon they moved to a private training ground belonging to He. He, moving a little to the side, stood in front of Hung and the dragon, and told the snake dragon lizard belonging to the protagonist to show its best. If this was really the case, he was going to give Hung his personal master's talisman. After all, he had tried hard and gone through many obstacles. He asked if this was true. Besides, he did not understand how one could be a master without his convenient talisman, and pointed his finger towards the lizard. The protagonist was delighted, and looking at the dragon, mentally asked that it not let him down, since it was on this that he depended on whether he would receive his talisman. He, meanwhile, smiled faintly, put his palm forward, and the ring on his finger began to shine, and he, summoning the stone armadillo bear, told it to play with the dragon. Noticing the huge bear, Hung and the dragon were equally horrified, their eyes widened and their mouths slightly open in amazement. Hung looked at He in bewilderment, and asked how many more evil element beasts he had. He noticed that every time he trained him, he summoned a different beast, and he, crossing his arms over his chest, laughed, asking Hung not to think about it, since he was sure that he was still too weak. After all, he had only tamed 10 or 20 high-danger class beasts, and only half of these beasts were at the level of the stone bear or lava tyrannosaurus. He pointed his hand towards his pet, and then, returning his attention to Hung, he offered him to show him that he wanted this talisman. The bear stood in a position ready to attack, and he, stretching his hand to the side, asked him to show him everything he was capable of, since the time had come. After all, this was the result of his labors. The bear roared, opening its mouth wide, and a powerful stream of wind appeared because of this, headed towards Heng and Lizard, who were forced to cover their eyes, protecting themselves from it. But suddenly Lizard's eyes shone, the monster frowned, and opened its mouth slightly, and streams of magical energy began to spread from the dragon's body. The protagonist shuddered slightly, frowning in confusion, because he realized that the magic that Lizard was now using was the power of the dragon, which is called the holding barrier. Noticing this too, he smiled, holding his chin with his hand, and said that it was good that the dragon hung at the growth stage could resist a full-fledged individual. Raising his palm, he stopped his bear. The monster dropped to all fours, obediently stopping behind his back. After that, he pointed his hand towards this and said that Hung should now attack this with the help of evil breath. The protagonist froze, holding his hair with his hand when he heard this order. However, very soon he already smiled, grinning confidently, and pointing his finger towards the bear, he offered Lizard to show them their skills, and ordered that it use a stream of evil thoughts. The monster readily opened its mouth, and next to it a cloud of magical energy appeared, from which streams of other magic began to spread. Having concentrated the required amount of magical energy, the dragon directed the attack forward, and a cloud of magical energy flew at high speed towards the shocked frozen bear. However, when the attack flew into the bear, it did not cause any damage to it, and the monster was even surprised, raising his gaze in order to focus on the place where the resulting rather weak attack flew. He, crossing his arms over his chest, smiled, asking, "Did Lizard really not eat enough porridge?" He exclaimed that this small ball of magical energy was nothing more than a tickle for the bear, and upon hearing this, the protagonist grinned, and then, confidently frowning, ordered the snake dragon to use the stream of evil thoughts, the pearl of evil. He stretched out his palm forward, and Lizard frowned, and then sent several attacks at once towards the bear. These attacks, flying one after another to the bear's head, were already causing it unpleasant sensations, and the monster frowned, and the next moment several stone chips bounced off the body of this one, forming a wound. The bear growled, feeling this, rose on its hind legs, and he even got a little scared, shuddering when he noticed this. Very soon he smiled, returning his attention to the protagonist, and praised him, admitting that he did not think that he had studied the evil breath technique so well and would use it in an attack. He noticed that he used a cluster of dark energy, and was able to create a real series of shots, as if bullets. The bear, having calmed down a little, sank down, pressing one of his paws to the place on his head where the attacks fired by Lizard flew. He meanwhile also paid attention to the fact that the dragon made a series of very accurate attacks, and said that it was not bad. Hung, with his hand on his hair, closed his eyes, smiling, noted that he was overpraising him. In his mind, he noted that there was actually another technique of the evil pearl that attacked so precisely that the opponent could not dodge, but attacks of this level could not penetrate the armor of the stone bear. He, smiling, summed up, declaring that he was satisfied with Heng's attacks, and holding out the palm of his hand on which the ring lay, he declared that this talisman ring now belonged to Heng, and although it could not accommodate as many beasts as his ring itself, however, this ring still contained 5 monsters. There was enough space to accommodate 5 beasts, and if Heng's tame beasts were to squeeze a little, then even 10 would fit. Taking the ring, the protagonist happily thanked he, but he warned that it was too early to rejoice, because although he had developed dragon technique and magic control quite well, his combat experience was 0. Real battles were the best way to increase this experience, and he said that he had decided to send Heng to the northern defense section, where he would have a great opportunity to fight dangerous types of beasts. He introduced this section and placed his hand on the protagonist's shoulder, explaining that in 3 days he should report to the military staff and inform them, and someone there would give him an assignment. He frowned upon hearing this, and his mouth opened excitedly. He remembered that behind the high walls of blacklight, there were 4 defensive lines that guarded the entire base. Each section of the defensive lines consisted of military camps, as well as many beast tamers. Heng imagined a man riding a dragon, as well as several warriors using weapons, as the tamers worked together with specially trained military personnel with firearms. The southern and northern borders were the most dangerous, as battles with dangerous beasts occurred here almost every day. Most of the materials in the city related to dangerous beasts were also the results of the hunts of the 4 major guns. He imagined the monster he had killed, and within 3 days, he had collected his advance payment for the next month of tamer benefits, which amounted to a whopping 250,000 yuan. Arriving at the office where he was to receive the money, he closed his eyes, smiled excitedly, and grabbed his hair when the girl, also a little excited, placed several bags filled with coins on the table in front of her. Heng spent most of the money he received on buying ingredients for lizard food, and he also spent 3 whole days preparing these ingredients into formulas in order to preserve the food as long as possible. Soon, there was quite a large pile of feed in front of him, and a little later, after an agreement with the military headquarters of the outer fortress, Heng went to the northern border, Outpost 7, as a member of the team. He arrived there in a special military vehicle, and while watching what was happening in the places they passed through the car window, he smiled slightly, thinking that the 4 defensive lines in the territory of the base were largely created for the plantations located in these wild places. After all, the area of land from which crops could be threatened was limited, and a total yield of the 7 plantations inside the gathering could not meet the needs of the 50,000 or 60,000 people living in the city. Working on the plantations outside the city was second only to joining the search parties in terms of danger, and it was also one of the most dangerous industries that the residents of the base tried to avoid, since monsters could appear on the plantation at any time and attack people. If Heng remembered correctly, Ding Quan, the head of Plantation Number 5, was assigned to Plantation Number 30, which was in the Northern Defensive Line's security zone. While he was pondering this, the car finally stopped and the driver announced that this was the 7th observation point, wishing him luck and warning him that he had to go back and report, so he had no intention of delaying Heng. The protagonist, getting out of the car, agreed with this and told the driver to move on. Xiao Huang, noticing Heng, shuddered in shock, asking if this newbie was actually brought in by the chief of staff himself. A one, standing nearby, asked if Huang hadn't heard that this was a master tamer. He pointed out that his luggage was literally stuffed with rations for the tamed beasts, and Huang frowned in confusion and asked if a one was serious. He didn't understand what he was expecting in that case, and offered to go help Heng. He agreed, frowning decisively, and together they ran up to the protagonist, shouting his name and getting his attention. He shuddered, not expecting something like that, and they, immediately taking a few bags, began to smile, asking how he could carry his things by himself. They asked him to let them do it for him, and Heng, frowning in confusion, asked why they should do that. Huang, pointing his finger at himself, smiled, giving his last name, and also telling him what Heng could call him. He anticipated his question about why he would do that, and announced that from now on, the safety of Point 7 depended only on the protagonist. Heng thought that such politeness was unnecessary, since Huang was older than him, and so he decided that he would call him by his full name. He smiled as he said this, and Huang even burst into tears, as it was the first time he had met a non-pompous tamer master. Hearing these words, Heng closed his eyes, smiling only more, and Huang, calling out to the other assistants who had also gone down, intending to take the bags of feed, hurried them, offering to finish quickly and arrange a feast for the main character. While the guys were carrying the feed, pulling it out of the car, Heng thought about the fact that there were only 29 guard posts on the northern border, and he had to report a stop at the 7th guard post. More than 10 years ago, this post was blown to pieces by a passing dangerous species, which did not leave a single survivor at the guard post. Since then, the entire modern guard post number 7 was rebuilt on the ruins. This was the place where Heng was supposed to break into his first real fight. He smiled enthusiastically as he thought about this, and after a while they moved to a place where there were huge pots filled with food, and Huang, having filled a plate, went to the protagonist, who was already sitting at the table, and offered him to try a one's dish, and although they did not have special conditions for preparing delicious food, however, in Huang's opinion, what a one cooked was simply excellent. Heng, hearing Huang call him Master Su, asked him to call him by his first name, since they were comrades in arms, and it would be strange if Huang addressed him that way. While they were talking about this, 2 other soldiers sat down next to each other, and Huang noted that the master tamer was a very important person, so he decided that he would call Heng by his full name. Heng chuckled, agreed to this and announced that Huang would call him by his full name, and he would call him by his full name, and at the same time each of them would think of their own. He smiled, closing his eyes, and then, becoming a little more serious, looked at the other warriors and admitted that he wanted to ask them something. He asked if they often encountered dangerous beasts here. A one, biting into a piece of meat, said that here they were still somewhere on the middle line, so the pressure on the defense was certainly less than at more distant posts. However, there were a lot of fish that could slip through the net. Pointing his finger to the side, he asked Heng to look at something. Turning around, the protagonist saw a large number of slain monsters, and a one explained that these were a lot of dangerous beasts that they had caught in the past few days. In the middle and at the end of each month, a military officer came here with a team from the city, who was in charge of transporting resources and honorary rewards. Also pointing his finger at the transparent box filled with monsters that was behind him, which was located behind him, Hung smiled, noting that it was indeed very difficult without a tamed beast. A1 was slightly embarrassed, and Xiao Hu, looking at the protagonist with admiration, asked what his beast could do. He asked him to show it to them, and Huang, hearing this, shuddered and frowned indignantly. He assumed that Hu was completely impudent, and asked if he really didn't know the rules. He wanted to say something about what could be done with tamed beasts, but before he finished speaking, Hung ordered his lizard to appear, and it, emerging from the ring, hung above Hang's head for a moment. With their eyes wide open in bewilderment, and their mouths slightly open, A1 and Hu simultaneously exclaimed in shock that this was the most dangerous species. The lizard, meanwhile, landed behind the protagonist, and he announced that this was his tamed beast, the snake dragon. Hu, clenching his fists, frowned with enthusiasm and asked, was the first beast Hung tamed really the most dangerous species? He thought it was very cool, and Lizard meanwhile activated the power of the shock and awe dragon and, concentrating a sufficient amount of magical energy around itself, directed it towards Hu, who screamed in horror. However, Hung suddenly hit Lizard on the head lightly, and it closed its eyes, losing its threatening atmosphere, and the protagonist, frowning, ordered it not to dare to attack their comrades, displeasedly noting that it had no manners. Lizard looked at him pitifully, almost crying, and the protagonist, looking worriedly at Hu, asked if he was okay. He, smiling, said that everything was fine, and noted that Heng's beast was very strong, so he was a great master. A1 suddenly laughed and, pointing his finger towards Hu, asked, was he really saying that he was okay? He noted that he almost shit his pants from fear, as he had done the other time, and Huang next to him also laughed, and he, embarrassed, cried out in embarrassment, ordering A1 not to talk nonsense, since nothing of the sort happened. Some time later, night fell, and after eating, Hung met all 5 of his brothers on duty. Smiling, they talked, and after a short recovery, Hung, on the advice of his mentor, began to train his mind power, using the spiritual hammer. Lizard, with his eyes closed, lay next to him, while the protagonist sat on the floor in the lotus position and closed his eyes to concentrate. The method that he advised him was called Crystal Mind and consisted of 3 stages. The first stage was to remove all distractions and create a crystal environment for meditation around himself, as if meditating on a giant crystal. Hung imagined the crystal, and then thought about the second stage, which was to work with a specific breathing rhythm, where he gradually became one with the meditative environment. Frowning in concentration, he began to breathe steadily, and a shining magical aura appeared around him. Finally, the third stage was about to begin, with the underlying method of the spiritual hammer. As Hing began the third stage, streams of magical energy swirled around him, lifting his cloak into the air, and after finishing his meditation, the protagonist opened his eyes, sighed, and noted that at his current progress, it would only take half a year to achieve a crystal clear mind, which was exactly what he had told him. He looked at his palms, and then thought that a monster like Su, who had refined her mind to crystal clear in just a month or so, must truly be as bright as the moon. Thinking about this, he turned his head, peering through the open window at the moon, and suddenly noticed that a lantern was shining on the roof of one of the towers, and an alarm sounded. Understanding what this meant, Hung shuddered, frowning, and at the same time, Huang ran into his room, urging him, announcing that it was time to get down to business. Looking to the side, Hung frowned confidently. Several insects flew towards the post, and using the device to see it more clearly, the protagonist guessed that it was a dangerous species of the second-rank scythe beetle, and said that instead of legs, it had armored claws that were sickles that could easily split a cobblestone. Huang stood next to him, tightly pressing his lips and listening attentively, and turning towards him, Hung removed the binoculars from his eyes and repeated that it was a dangerous species of the second-rank scythe beetle. Huang thoughtfully put his hand to his chin, noting that the scythe beetle was the most common type of beast in their point. At least these insects reproduced quickly, but killing 4 at once was not a problem. With a wave of his hand, he attracted the attention of all team members and ordered them to prepare for battle. He and Lao Yu were to be at the machine gun position of the watchtower, A1 was to take the forward sniper position on the northwest side. Hu and Xiao Lu were to guard shooting ranges 5 and 6 on the first level. Huang called out to his comrades seriously, offering to help Hung finish off these monsters. The warriors agreed, and soon, having taken their positions, they began firing bullets towards the monsters. These beetles had an ability of a dangerous kind, which was called perception. The monsters protected themselves from the bullets with the armor casting technique, but one of the projectiles, colliding with the shield, bent, but cracks still appeared on the shield, and it eventually split, and the bullet, whose speed was maintained despite the obstacle, flew forward, striking the monster. Huang, smiling happily, asked the others to look at the fact that they finished off the monster, but noted that the main thing to remember is not to damage the monster's heads, because otherwise they will not be given any military awards for this. He fired again, and Hung, carefully watching what was happening, noted that the side beetle's best skill is armor casting, and it is not very effective, but it significantly weakens the effect of ordinary bullets. Raising his head, he looked at One, who was sitting a little higher on the tower with his weapon. He thought that by continuously firing the machine gun, he could create a great opportunity for the sniper to act, and once again raising the binoculars to his eyes, he peered at the monster whose shield was being fired at by other warriors. Gradually, the defense began to disintegrate, and cracks began to crawl across its surface. Squinting one eye to aim more accurately, One exclaimed that he needed to act now, and clenched his jaws and fired. The shell, hitting the monster, tore its body into several pieces, and Hung asked himself in shock, was this really the battlefield of the northern border? Although all these people were not master tamers, their understanding of the situation and the skills honed in repeated battles were enough to provide all the necessary combat power. He peered at his comrades, who were destroying the monsters one by one, and suddenly noticed that one of the bugs began to run away. The others also noticed this, and Huang, warning about it, started to run away, told the protagonist to follow him, and also called Hu, offering to finish off this monster together. Hu ran with them, and getting into the car, they drove forward, driving outside the tower. Hu climbed out of the hole in the roof of the car in order to take up the weapon. Huang sat at the wheel, and Hung settled down next to him on the neighboring seat. They caught up with the beetle quite quickly, and driving around it from the side, stopped in front of it. The beetle shuddered, frozen in surprise, and when the car stopped, the protagonist got out of it, and then walked a little further forward, pressing his lips tighter and looking intently at the monster. Huang told Hu to watch the inner boundary, since everyone there was gilded, so they needed to be on their guard. Hu, frowning, began to carry out the order, declaring that he understood everything. Stopping in front of the monster, the protagonist looked at it for a while, and then extended his hand forward, on which he wore a ring, and suggested that they first look at what would happen to the monster after the evil attack. He smiled, and when magical energy began to shine around him, Lizard appeared in front of him, rising into the air with the help of wings, and activated an evil attack. Streams of magical energy began to gather around it, and the beetle shuddered in fear, noticing this. The monster closed itself with armor, but the attack that Lizard launched broke through it, and the dragon itself, taking advantage of this, attacked, colliding with the monster and pushing it far back. The beetle flew to the side, and Lizard immediately activated magical energy, directing it forward. Having fallen to the ground, the monster tried to rise, crying out restlessly, and Hung thought that the armor that the monster was using really worked so well that it reflected his attack and received almost no damage. He frowned seriously and commanded Lizard to use the evil thought stream, the evil pearl, and the dragon frowned in concentration, and then opened its mouth, sending several charges of concentrated magical energy towards the beetle. The beetle closed itself with a shield, and the attacks, flying into it, caused damage to it, but the shield stood, and Heng, holding his chin with his hand, noticed that the monster had very thick skin. The monster, meanwhile, raised its front paws up, removing its defense, and Lizard took advantage of this, and Heng, stretching out his hand forward, commanded it to use shock and awe. It strengthened the magical energy around itself, opened its mouth, directing the attack towards the beetle, and the monster trembled, frozen in place, and the protagonist, clenching his palm into a fist, said that the power of the dragon would tear this monster apart. The lizard growled, frowning, and a stream of magical energy flew forward, injuring the monster. The beetle turned and began to run away, and noticing this, Hung exclaimed that this would not happen, and commanded the lizard to activate the power of the earth. It slammed its paw on the ground, activating a different kind of magic, and sharp stone spikes began to rise along the ground from this towards the beetle, which, having reached the beetle, pierced its body. The monster twitched and then died, and Hu and Huang, who were sitting in the car, froze in shock, smiling. Sweating slightly from excitement, Hu noted that Hung did not need their help, and Huang admitted that he was covered in goosebumps, amazed by the sight they saw. Some time later, when they had already returned to the tower, Hu began to emotionally recount what they had seen, and announced that at one point he heard Heng shout out an incantation of the power of the earth. He asked if the others knew what happened after that. Immediately, he said that spears pierced the beetle from right under the ground, like an ordinary pumpkin, and everyone else who listened to this screamed in shock, calling Hung cool. Hwang, placing his hand on the protagonist's shoulder, smiled, admitting that he had previously thought that he, like all sweaty newbies, simply decided to strike it rich, but it turned out that he himself was a real nugget. Now he was very impressed and exclaimed that Hung was really cool, encouraging him to continue doing so. The protagonist looked at him in surprise, and then, closing his eyes, awkwardly scratched his head with his hand and tried to refuse these words, noting that they all tried. Suddenly, a soldier ran closer to them, who, attracting Hwang's attention, announced that someone was coming here. Hung and Hwang shuddered, looking at each other, and Hwang decided that he needed to take a look. Frowning in concentration, the protagonist agreed to go and take a look, and together they ran to the edge of the observation tower, frowned in concentration and looked at the command convoy that was approaching the tower. Hwang thought it was strange since usually when they were counting the military supplies, the commanders didn't come to them until midday, after they had visited each watchtower. He didn't understand why they had come so early today, and asked about it. Hung opened his mouth, amazed, and thought that it simply couldn't be what he was assuming. Meanwhile, the convoy drove into the tower, and the commander-in-chief of the Northern Defensive Line, Lu Ling, got out of the car. Hwang and the other warrior, having come down, frowned seriously, greeting him, and Ling, looking at Hwang, noted that they hadn't seen each other for so many years, and he was still the same. He smiled slightly, and Hwang, taking out a small handkerchief, burst into tears, starting to wipe away his tears, and admitted that he didn't even think that Ling remembered his name. He was very flattered by this, and noted that the commander-in-chief had come all this way to work with them. Ling cried out, frowning, as he had not expected such a reaction, and then, waving his hand, he tried to calm Hwang down, announcing that it was less than 10 minutes' drive from the barrier to this place. After that, he approached the protagonist and asked if he was getting used to it here. He lifted the sunglasses that he had been wearing and looked at Hung, and Hung, slightly shuddering, began to sweat from excitement, and instead of answering the question, said that he needed to report to the commander-in-chief about what was happening. Coming even closer to him, Ling put his hand on his shoulder and asked what he said. Hung, frowning seriously, announced that he had met all of his comrades in service and had adapted well to life here. Suddenly, Ling placed his palm on his head, exclaiming that there was no need to speak to him so formally. He added that the teacher had already told him several times that he had taken on a new, very talented disciple, and smiled, adding that he had heard the chief of staff say that Hung had not seen him when he came to the headquarters, and that they had simply missed each other the last time because he had gone to exterminate those stupid monsters. However, Ling had decided to come again in order to kill and see Hwang in person, and upon hearing this, Awan and Hwang frowned in shock, wondering at the same time if the commander-in-chief had come to their small post for Heng's sake. Hwang closed his eyes and sighed, mentally noting that he had thought that Heng was an ordinary master, but he had not even known that he was the personal disciple of their burgomaster. He also noted that they were lucky that he had not caused any trouble during this time, and at this time Ling, turning his attention to them, asked displeasedly why they were standing like pillars. He asked that they start summing up the battles of the last half-month at the post and not interfere with him and Heng. They immediately agreed to the order, and Ling, returning his attention to the protagonist, pointed a finger in his direction and, smirking, asked him to call his snake dragon. He also explained that the mentor specifically instructed him to come and monitor his development in order to report to him later. Hung became nervous upon hearing this, since he thought that he had forgotten about him as soon as he left the city, but it turned out that he had already sent his spy. Still, he obeyed and, waving his hand, told the snake dragon to come out. Lizard appeared above him, surrounded by magical energy, and Ling raised his head, froze in shock and looked at the dragon, crying out in amazement. He opened his mouth slightly, and the cigarette he had been clenching with his teeth fell out, while Lizard landed on the ground, raising small clouds of dust. Still amazed, Ling called out to the protagonist and asked if his dragon hadn't hatched a little less than a month ago. Heng stroked Lizard, who narrowed his eyes in pleasure, and then said that his dragon had grown very quickly since it learned to use dragon magic. He pretended to be a fool and did not understand anything, and touched his cheek with his finger, asking if something was wrong. Ling, sweating from excitement, smiled, exclaiming that everything was fine, and noted that his pet had grown even more in its time. Suddenly he became more serious and frowned, rolling his knuckles with his fingers, and said that the mentor asked him to find out how well Hung had honed his dragon's fighting skills. He also had his own tame dragon, so he was going to let it test Heng's dragon. The protagonist became slightly nervous, and Ling raised his hand, activated his ring, and told the dragon to come out and have fun with his opponent. He had a horned earth dragon, and when he shouted out the name of it, the monster appeared behind him and roared menacingly. Ling thoughtfully put his hand to his chin, noting that the horned earth dragon was a dangerous species with two bloodlines, earth and dragon, and the same racial rank as the snake dragon lizard. The horned earth dragon was bred by him to the level of a full-fledged dangerous species, and thanks to its thick skin and horns, it was able to resist second-rank beasts at the end of its growth for a short period of time. Hung and Lizard were excited when they saw the enemy, and Ling, winking, added that he had one of the main advantages, and the next moment his dragon was very close to the protagonist's dragon, and it trembled, closing its eyes, and then looked pitifully at Hung. Noticing the state of Lizard, he stroked it, and squinting, it barely held back tears, and Hung, excitedly looking at Ling, asked him to tell his dragon to be softer, because it could simply trample Lizard. Ling asked again in bewilderment, and then laughed, asking him not to worry, since his dragon knew the measure and would not harm Lizard. Saying this, he smiled relaxedly so that the protagonist would not doubt his words, and Hung confidently frowned, agreed, suggesting that Ling act in this case. He pointed his hand forward and addressed his horned dragon, noting that the snake dragon had not yet woken up and suggested waking it up with a small earthquake. The horned dragon struck the ground with its paw, and cracks began to spread in different directions from this, and fragments of earth began to fly into the air. Hung screamed, barely standing on his feet, and frowned, and then suddenly shuddered, opening his eyes wide, and noticed that Ling was hanging in the air, realizing that it was levitation. This was the advantage of being able to control spiritual power after training the power of the mind, but the protagonist was distracted from this, as he realized that now was not the time to think about it. He frowned in concentration and turned to Lizard, commanding it to use an evil attack and dodge the attacks. The dragon, placing its paws on his shoulders, began to rise into the air, and Hung carefully looked at the enemy. When they rose higher above the ground, Hung waved his hand, commanding Lizard to use an evil pearl against this horned dragon. Lizard, who had already released him by this point, released several magic projectiles at once, which were directed towards the dragon. However, this activated durability without damage, and no attack dealt damage to it. Hung, watching this, noted that counting on Lizard defeating the horned dragon was just a dream, and thought that even losing gracefully would already be great. All he could do was show the results of the dragon's cultivation, which he had achieved all this time, and not disappoint the teacher, who was so worried, being tens of kilometers away. He frowned excitedly, and then extended his hand to the side, reminding Lizard that the advantage of this is speed, ordering it to surround the enemy with evil pearls. It sped up, the aura of magical energy around it became larger, and moving quickly, Lizard sent attacks of magical projectiles towards the enemy from different directions. The earth dragon began to look around, but it did not have time to follow Lizard, and at some point it, having stopped, opened its mouth slightly, gathering a particularly strong attack near it, and sent a powerful volley straight into the back of the earth dragon, who cried out in surprise. A small wound appeared on its body, and Hung, frowning seriously, said that Lizard should now use the power of the earth to recover. It instantly fell to the ground, activating another magical energy, and closed its eyes, recovering, and the earth dragon raised its paw, ready to continue the battle. Hung shouted that it was time to use the dragon's power of the earth dance, and the lizard opened its mouth slightly, but then roared, and sharp stone spikes began to rise forward from the ground. These spikes reached the earth dragon, who froze, watching this. Suddenly, the dragon became even more angry and hit the ground with its paw with force, and the resulting shock wave threw the lizard to the side. It, with its eyes closed, flew off, hitting the ground hard, and Heng, excitedly calling out to it, went down the stairs from the high ground, running up to the lizard. Ling, who was watching this, crossed his arms over his chest, closed his eyes and laughed, and said that Heng's tactics were not bad, but the earth dragon's power was already at the 9th level, so the earth dance was nothing to it. Heng frowned, looked at Ling seriously and asked, didn't he say that he should use everything he could to avoid disappointing the teacher? He stroked Lizard, who was almost in tears from pain and disappointment, and Ling chuckled, admitting that he didn't mean to offend the protagonist, since it really looked like that, but he simply already understood what snake dragons lizards were capable of. He walked closer to him, finally landing on the ground, and said that all this was not bad, assuming that he would be very pleased. He placed his hand on the shoulder of the surprised Heng, and then, moving away with him, said that his snake dragon was developing much faster than Ling's own dragon. He also noted that he really took in a very talented young disciple. As they walked away, the Earth Dragon also placed his hand on Lizard's back in order to calm it down a little. Soon after the Commander-in-Chief left, winter came and it was very cold at the guard post. The walls were not as high and strong as those at the base, which could shelter from the winter cold, so the soldiers were shivering from the cold even lying in special sleeping bags fully clothed. One waking up said in a trembling voice that it was very cold here, and it was only the beginning of winter. He was shaking violently, clenching his jaw, and, hearing his indignation, his comrade lying next to him said that in that case one should become a master tamer, since he had a spiritual cover and was warm. Suddenly, an alarm sounded, and abruptly getting up, the guy warned everyone about it, ordering them to move faster. Everyone began to get up, and Huang, running into the room, said that guard post number 3 in the northern part called, saying that a group of dangerous species had attacked plantation number 25. Everyone shuddered, and Huang, waving his hand, attracted the attention of Hung and Hu, announcing that they would now go in response to a call from the third post, and Yu and Awan were to guard the house. Waving his hand, he beckoned his comrades to follow him, and everyone, agreeing with the order, immediately stood up, starting to carry it out. Soon they were already in the car, and Huang said that according to Captain Li, the situation was really serious now, since almost the entire 25th plantation was completely captured. More than 20 individuals of the dangerous species and about 5 individuals of the less dangerous species had entered the territory. He frowned excitedly as he told this, and added that all the plantation workers were now locked in the staff quarters and they had about a dozen broken guns that they were somehow fighting back with. He imagined the destroyed fence of the tower, as well as the animals that ran into the territory of this one, and said that it was only a matter of time before the animals got inside. He imagined the angry look of one of these monsters and noted that they were going to gather support for all patrol base posts 3 and 4 in the northern sector, as well as the main force, which would almost entirely go out to defend the plantation. The gathering had to be completed by 4 a.m., since the attack would begin at exactly that time. Noting that it was now 4 hours and 30 minutes, he ordered Hu to drive faster, and he agreed to this, and soon they arrived at plantation number 25 at post 3 and gate 6. Several cars drove into the area, and Huang, putting his hand to his forehead, told someone to report that he, Hung, and Hu from post 7 on the northern border had arrived at the designated place. The man standing on the guard tower told them to drive faster, announcing that he would transmit information by radio. Huang agreed to this and they drove on, hearing the voice of one of the warriors come from the radio inside the car, saying that they had done some reconnaissance. The monsters had broken through the 6th gate on the northwest side and were now in the grain area, tearing pieces out of the dead bodies. All the survivors had been moved to the staff room and were now defending themselves, strengthening the defense. The cars continued to drive, gathering in one place, and the man said that all the fighting squads and all the vehicles were to line up in a spear shape, and the 2 armored vehicles would be used as the tips of the spears, directly attacking and firing at the dormitory mission in the plantation. The cars lined up as the soldier said and heard him advise them to be more careful, as the dangerous species that had invaded here were poison wolves, which were resistant to attacks and could easily bite off a person's head. The man who spoke ordered the soldiers who were heading to the plantation to immediately kill these monsters and free them. The cars, having reached the right place, began to shoot, directing attacks at the wolves, who, roaring furiously, jumped up, trying to dodge the attacks. Suddenly, one of the monsters, who was a little to the side, frowned, and then, raising his head, screamed, and a large number of wolves immediately ran to attack. Hung, frowning excitedly, ran up to Hu, who was sitting behind the wheel of the car, and shouted that something was wrong. He asked him to move back a little, and Hu shuddered when he heard this request, and Huang, also not quite understanding what was happening, attracted the attention of the protagonist and asked how he felt. Looking at him, Hung asked if it was true that he also heard that wild howl. He explained that he had heard from the teacher that a dangerous species like the poisonous wolf could evolve into the final form of an alpha wolf. Before he could respond to his explanation, Huang suddenly shouted that something was wrong, asking the protagonist to look at the wolves that were moving away. He looked through the front window of the car at the wolves, asking if the monsters were planning something. Hung clenched his jaw and assumed that the leader who was guiding them was to blame for all of this. In that case, it didn't seem surprising to him that so many individuals had broken through the fortification. Meanwhile, the larger wolf frowned, and magical energy began to spread from its body. This poisonous wolf activated the poisonous fog skill, and clouds of this magical energy descended downwards, flying between the cars. The people in the cars began to ask in fear, "What is this?" Finally, they realized that it was a poisonous fog and began to repeat it, and the man transmitted a message to them on the radio, ordering them to turn on the infrared sight, be alert, and not to miss their teammates. Everyone listened to these words excitedly, and then Heng, looking towards Hu, warned that it was not that simple, and ordered him to move back. He promised that he would do it, and clenched his jaws, starting to fulfill the request of the protagonist, and suddenly Huang, screaming, asked Heng to look at it, and turned his head to the side, noticing a huge wolf, which, opening its mouth wide, jumped on a car that was very close. The monster, waving its paw, dented the roof of the car, and the driver of this screamed in horror, opening his eyes wider, when the metal of which the car was made was dented, and the glass cracked, flying into fragments to the sides. The monster, as well as several smaller wolves, continued to destroy the machine, killing the people inside it, and Heng, looking more closely at the monster, noticed that it was only a companion, which was called a shadow wolf. He said that this was a special ability of the poison wolf leader, called a shadow double, and he realized that this meant that there was another leader here. Frowning, Huang noticed that this monster was approaching, and took out his gun, pointing it at the huge wolf, who ran towards their car. When he reached the car, the wolf collided with it, and from how strong this impact was, the car windows broke, and Huang was unable to shoot, since he had to cover his face with his hand to avoid injury. The car almost flipped over, but it still remained upright, and the wolf ran away from it for a short time, and Hu managed to level the car. Huang, sticking his gun out the window, clenched his jaws, cursing. He noted it was very difficult. He began to shoot, and shouted that he could not even slightly penetrate the wolf's armor. The projectiles he fired at the wolf running next to the car did not cause any damage to the monster, and at one point, pushing off the ground with his paws with force, the monster jumped up, ending up above the roof of the car, and swung his paw to hit the car. The impact of this broke the roof of the car, pieces of metal flew in different directions, and Heng shuddered, opening his eyes wider, and suddenly noticed that the wolf appeared right in front of him, sticking his head into the hole formed in the car. The monster opened its mouth, sticking out sharp fangs, from which saliva was dripping, and the protagonist called Lizard. The next moment, a dragon, shrouded in a magical aura, appeared in front of him, furiously glaring at the wolf, and activated the power of the dragon shock and awe. Waves of magical energy began to spread from this, heading towards the wolf, who shuddered, feeling the power of someone else's magical energy. Not intending to stop, Lizard immediately after this attack activated the stream of evil thoughts, the pearl of evil, forming clots of dark strong magical energy, and directing these attacks one after another towards the wolf. The shells, crashing into the monster, exploded, causing damage to it, and in the end the monster, unable to stand, flew to the side, and Lizard rose into the air to strike again if necessary. But this was not necessary, since the wolf had already died, and the next moment Heng, taking the radio, turned to the commander, calling his name, and asked that the rest of the machine stop firing in order to avoid accidental injuries. He promised that he would deal with the leader of the poisonous wolves, and frowned in concentration, and the captain, watching him through binoculars, thought that all this was not surprising, because he was his disciple, and he already had such strength, although they were in the training stage. Taking the radio, he ordered everyone to stop firing to support the number 10 military vehicle in the northern area, and then, turning to Heng, he shouted that the leader of the poisonous wolves would be his responsibility, and they would take care of the other details so as not to interfere with his battle. Heng agreed to this and jumped off the destroyed vehicle, and the dragon flew after him. Soon, he, Huang, and Hu ran forward, and one of them cursed, drawing attention to the fact that the fog was very thick. This person was wondering where the leader was, and suddenly Huang, drawing Heng's attention, asked him to look at something that was off to the side. He turned around, and the protagonist, startled, also looked in the direction he pointed, and the next moment, he frowned, opening his eyes wider, as he saw a huge wolf that began to destroy the armored vehicle. Because it was hitting the car, explosions were happening, and one of the guys inside the car started begging for someone to help him. He was desperate and couldn't do anything, and the wolf raised its paw to attack him again, but it didn't have time to do so, because Heng, running towards the monster, ordered it to move away from the guy, and also shouted for Lizard to activate it with an angry attack. The dragon flew forward, opening its mouth wide, and very soon it was already next to the wolf, clinging to its neck with its fangs. Blood spurted out of the monster's mouth. It, unable to stay on its feet, fell on its back, screaming. However, the wolf quickly came to its senses and, growling, stood up, approaching the guy from behind. Meanwhile, He, not noticing the monster, thanked Hung, exclaiming that he saved him. He closed his eyes, smiling and laughing, admitting that he already thought he was going to die. However, the protagonist, who saw the monster behind the guy, ran forward, ordering him not to stand still, but to run. The guy looked at him in confusion, but before he started running, suddenly the sharp part of the tail pierced his body, and the guy's eyes widened in amazement. Hung froze, his mouth slightly open in shock, and the monster pulled the sharp part of its tail out of the guy's body. The warrior fell to the ground, blood appeared on his clothes, and Hung and the dragon looked at their dead comrade in horror. However, the protagonist quickly distracted himself from these emotions and, calling the wolf a name, he turned to Lizard, ordering it to use Earth Dance. He frowned deeply as he looked at his opponent, and Lizard slammed its paw down on the ground with force, causing cracks to spread out in different directions, and sharp stone spikes to rise up. Lizard spread its wings wider as it looked at its opponent, and the wolf frowned and activated the poisonous wolf's ability, which was called Sinister Strike. Just as the stone spikes, growing larger, reached the place where the wolf had been standing, the wolf used its ability to jump to the side, avoiding the attack. Noticing that this was a great opportunity, Hung called out to Hu and told him to shoot at the monster. Hu and Huang, who were hiding behind some rubble a little to the side, took aim, shouting that they understood, and began shooting. The bullets flying out of their guns flew towards the wolf at high speed, and it, noticing the attack from the other side, flinched, and then activated the attack again, quickly and jumping in different directions in order to avoid being injured by the bullets. However, when the monster once again tried to jump to the side, Lizard, blocking this path, flew into the monster's neck, opening its mouth wider, and the wolf was unable to stay on its feet and also unable to dodge this attack, and the dragon sank its teeth into the neck of this one, frowning seriously. Hung, pointing a finger towards the wolf, shouted that he knew that it would try to escape, and ordered Lizard to activate shock and awe. Flying a little to the side, Lizard froze, sending waves of magical energy at the wolf, who trembled, frozen in place. After that, Lizard activated the dragon's power by raising his paw, and streams of darker magical energy began to flow towards it. Having concentrated the required amount of power, Lizard swung his paw, striking the wolf's head with it, and this blow was so strong that the wolf's body was pierced through, and a large amount of blood flew out from the back of its head. Some time later, the half-destroyed car was driving between the rocks, and turning in his seat towards him, who was sitting behind him. Huang excitedly attracted his attention and asked how he was feeling. He noticed that he was in a bad mood, and asked if this was true. The protagonist, touching his ring with his fingers, said that everything was fine, explaining that he was just thinking. Huang smiled, closing his eyes, trying to lighten the mood, and announced that in the past, no one usually brought in the tamer masters for an invasion of this scale, but if it weren't for Hung, there would have been at least twice as many casualties. He also exclaimed that this time, Hung really saved them, and lifting up the sleeve of his shirt, he showed a scar that ran across most of his arm, asking the protagonist to look at it, that he had this scar from the first time he fought to save the plantation. That battle was much more terrible than this one, and more than 50 people were killed and wounded. He remembered the ruins, as well as a large number of wounded dead warriors lying on the rocks in their own blood. He also said that the armored car was smashed to scrap metal by a huge steel gorilla in its mature form, which turned the entire crew into mush. He also recalled the moment when the monster crushed the armored vehicle with its fist, and then declared that in the end it was Chao, who was then the commander-in-chief of the Northern Front, who personally killed the beast and ended that bloody battle. He recalled how the warrior, raising his weapon, stood on top of the body of the slain man and the monster, and, at that moment, taking a small flask in his hands, Huang handed it to Hung, telling him to drink a little, since, according to his assumption, it should become easier. The protagonist first looked at him in surprise, and then, taking the flask, thanked him and said that he understood him. Huang declared that this was inevitable, since they, ordinary people, live here like floating leaves, without roots and support. He knew that no one could guarantee that they would sleep tonight and wake up tomorrow to see the sun, and only if they were master tamers like him would they truly have the ability to control their own fate. The protagonist looked at him in shock and said his name, and then, placing his hand on his shoulder, he said that there was no need to think about such things, suggesting that they return home. He admitted that he wanted to eat the food that one had prepared for them, and Huang laughed, closing his eyes, agreeing with this, and suggesting that they eat more so that one would even get tired of cooking for them, and Hung also smiled. The battle to save the plantations was the first time that the protagonist had faced death face to face, and he seemed like a real fighter who, after this nightmare, finally realized that only constant effort could help him preserve himself and protect others in this chaotic world. And realizing this, he pressed his lips tighter, frowned, and clenched his fist. Over the next month, Hung began special training for himself and Lizard according to the rituals of the ancient dragons, and achieved remarkable results. During one such training, he stretched out his hand with a concentrated frown, and Lizard, opening its mouth wide, flew in the direction Hung pointed. Not only did Lizard grow in size, its mastery of these three elements increased by 100 times, it learned new skills, improved it, and also strengthened the effect. The dragon now looked more threatening, and just when Hung was deep in training, an old acquaintance of his arrived at the 7th post. Ling, who was riding on a super dangerous-looking fire magical lion, waved his hand in greeting as he entered the post, and smiled as he greeted Hung. He, without responding to the greeting, froze, his eyes wide open, and looked at Ling with delight, mentally noting that this was very cool, and wondered with interest if he would also be able to ride his dragon. Jumping down from the lion's back, Ling attracted Heng's attention and, coming closer to him, frowned, smiled, and placing his palms on the protagonist's shoulders, he began to shake him from side to side, exclaiming that he heard that last time he participated in the battle for the plantation and showed himself very well on the battlefield, and he was even praised by the commander. He noted that this was simply wonderful, and declared that this was how the burgomaster's apprentice should behave. While he was saying all this, Hung simply remained silent with his mouth slightly open in astonishment, and did not resist when Ling shook him. However, the moment he stopped, the protagonist smiled slightly excitedly, raising his finger up, and remembered that Ling had said that he should come here every month, and asked if it had already been a month since he was here last time? Ling asked if it hadn't? Without waiting for Hung to answer, he exclaimed that it made no difference, and said that he simply had a few free days, so he decided to visit Hung now in order not to ruin his plans later. He finally removed his hands from the protagonist's shoulders, and then told him to now call his snake dragon Lizard to train it and make up for all the time he had missed. Hung closed his eyes, frowned slightly in excitement, scratched his head with his palm, but still agreed, and in the next moment, he smiled confidently, frowned, and raised his palm, activating the ring, summoning his snake dragon. The monster, whose size was already several times larger than Hung himself, appeared behind him, surrounded by magical energy, and frowned in concentration. Looking at Ling, Ling was very shocked when he noticed the size of the dragon, and sweated from the tension, frowned and shouted that the dragon was growing very quickly. He asked, did Hung really have the perfect formula? He, with an excited smile, said that he always used the formula that he gave him, and guessed that it just suited his dragon very well. Ling didn't know what to say to this and simply froze in shock, and then waved his hand and turned away, asking Hung to put the dragon back, as he was sure that he didn't need to experience this anymore. Hung looked at him in confusion, and Ling waved his hand and explained that according to he, once the lizard reached the middle stage of growth, the protagonist's training on the northern front would end. Hung shuddered upon hearing this and asked, is it really happening so soon? Huang and Awan, who were nearby and heard this, hugged each other and burst into tears, just like their other comrades who were nearby. Hung shuddered and looked at them in confusion, sweating from excitement, and Huang, wiping away his tears with a handkerchief, tried to calm down and exclaimed that they couldn't empty the protagonist so quickly. Awan closed his eyes and added that they wouldn't be able to sleep anymore if he left, and Hung asked with a smile if they were serious about that. He suggested that in that case, he should ask Lizard to sit with him, and hearing this, Huang suddenly calmed down and asked why Hung was telling him that. Pointing his finger at Awan, he declared that he was the one who said all that, and hearing this accusation, Awan flinched, frowning indignantly, and then asked so what if he couldn't sleep. The protagonist laughed and said that now they wouldn't be able to get away or run away, but would run around before going to bed with his little lizard. The next day, in Blacklight's training room, Hung fell to the floor and screamed, noting that he couldn't do it anymore. Lin Fu smiled as he looked at the small watch in his palm and thought that the protagonist was a good man to have lasted this long. This meant that he had truly not been lazy this month, just as he had said. Fu was his chief steward, the castle master's assistant, and his loyal servant. He had once been his father's servant, and he was also an expert in the field of spiritual cultivation of the mind and a professional in coin processing. Soon, Fu bowed slightly and closed his eyes as he approached and congratulated him on taking on a good disciple. Although Hung was not as talented as his first sister, he was still very persistent and had used the spiritual hammer method this month, laying a good foundation for their training. He crossed his arms and looked at Hung with a smile, admitting that he did not think that his internship would end so quickly, that is, in just 1 month. However, he supposed that it was still a difficult experience, and an exciting event for the protagonist. Hung awkwardly held his hair with his hand, smiled with his eyes closed, and said that he worked hard. Thinking back to when he was meditating, he thought that the growth and spiritual development of the lizard was so vividly felt through cultivation and training, and it was much better than when he sat for 3 years waiting for even the slightest progress from his egg, experiencing failure after failure. Thinking back to the moments in his past, he asked himself, could such an experience be called difficult? After that, he smiled confidently, clenching his hand into a fist, and he noted that the fact that Heng's snake dragon lizard was trained and raised to such a high level exceeded his expectations and gave him more confidence in Heng's future success. The protagonist looked at him with hope and admiration and asked if he had already arranged to transfer him to another military post. However, he said that this was not the case and explained that he wanted Heng to participate in the Six Lands tournament next month. Heng shuddered at this proposal, and he explained that the Six Lands tournament was held once a year and was a dual tournament held in each of the 6 major bases. Some people thought that it was just an ordinary tournament, but in fact, it was held for the sake of the opportunity to enter the Blood Forest ruins. Heng asked if he really needed these ruins. He wondered if there were any other ruins near their base, and he smiled excitedly and explained that these Blood Forest ruins were naturally very different from the ordinary ruins that could be found throughout their wilderness. He said that the outside of these very ruins is separated by a hidden energy barrier that makes it impenetrable, and the ruins themselves are occupied by an extremely powerful and terrifying race of beasts, and the owner of this mysterious place is a being of terrifying strength and power. As he said this, he imagined a forest surrounded by an energy barrier, as well as the silhouette of a monster that was inside these ruins. After that, he noted that when 6 representatives from each base joined forces against this monster, the beast was forced to come to an agreement with the discoverers, and only then did it promise to open the secret lands once a year on its own initiative, allowing 3 master tamers to enter the secret lands and explore it, holding a tournament. He introduced the portal while talking about it, and Hun called out to him, pointing out that this was a very rare opportunity to enter the secret lands, and asked if that meant that he would have many very strong competitors. He asked if he had the slightest chance of winning. He was very excited and sweating slightly from the tension, clenching his palms into fists, and he laughed and called him stupid, asking him not to worry. Hung looked at him puzzled, and he explained that the area opened to people by the master of the Blood Forest ruins was also only the outer part of the ruins, and the inner perimeter and core were not fully opened, and it was indeed a treasure for new masters like Hung, and it was less attractive to true experts. He held his chin with his hand, and the protagonist smiled resolutely and exclaimed, if he said so, then he would definitely try. He smiled, exclaiming that this was the way it should be, and added that in addition to Hung, there would be 4 other participants competing this time, announcing that he would arrange for him to meet and get acquainted with them tomorrow, after which he would begin a new special training. Hung asked with interest, where would he undergo this training? He winked, and announced that he would undergo it in the Grizzly Forest, and upon hearing this, the protagonist asked again, startled, and frowned with excitement. In the southern section of the defense line south of the vast wilderness, there was a large black forest that occupied an extremely large area, and this place was called the Grizzly Forest. There were an astonishing number of bears with a body length of 4 meters and a weight of a ton living there, and these bears were not listed among the dangerous creatures only because these monsters were unable to use energy. However, sometimes bears would appear that were astonishing in their fighting power, and these monsters were such that even the masters were afraid of them. Such bears fully deserved the reputation of being able to stop children from crying at night, and when such monsters attacked people, they did not try to fight, but simply ran away in panic. Recalling all this, Hung, with a trembling voice, attracted his attention and asked if the Grizzly Forest was not a dangerous place. He said that he would understand it himself when he got there, and advised him to clean himself up beforehand. He and Fu began to leave, and Hung, still scared, called out to him, but he no longer paid attention to it. A little later, as the evening gradually approached, Hung returned home, pressed his lips tighter and looked at the 2 coins lying alone on the table, thinking that the allowance of 250,000 steel coins was almost used up, and the next allowance payment would have to wait more than half a month. In order to maintain the current growth rate of lizard, there should be no shortage of food, and after thinking about this, Hung turned around, looking excitedly at his dragon, who was eating food with his eyes closed. Postponing the advance payment every time was not a long-term solution, and so Hung realized that he needed to find a way to make money. He frowned seriously, pressing his lips tighter, and thought that there were actually many ways for a tamer to make money. He sat straight on the table, starting to thoughtfully roll the coins, and noted that the tamers of healer pets were able to heal illnesses and wounds, and they had a good income. He imagined a girl who was using her pet to heal a sick man, and also noted that pets related to vegetation could increase crop yields, and they were also paid well for this, and he imagined a similar situation, and then he turned his attention to the tamers of water and electric pets, who also collected resources, but with the help of an ancient dragon, a more effective way could be found, and while thinking about this, closed his eyes, putting his palm to his forehead. Some time later, at the trading market, which was a gathering place for black lanterns, the vendors were asking customers to come to their stands quickly, advertising only the latest and best products at a low price. Someone was trying to entice customers by selling an item for only 2 coins, and Hun walked among the people who were looking at the offered goods, and excitedly thought that he originally wanted to take advantage of the opportunity, but he did not find anything all day. Suddenly, one of the men began to attract the attention of the customers by announcing that they would buy black fat at a high price. Hearing this, Hun shuddered as he approached the store, and tapped his finger on the tabletop, asking seriously if these people were buying black fat. Another man who was also in the store frowned, looking seriously at the protagonist, and confirmed that they were buying black fat, and then said that they were doing so at a high price, and asked what Hun wanted. He assumed that he had the goods, but the protagonist said that he did not, explaining that he just wanted to ask these men what they needed it for. He smiled, showing his good intentions, but the man waved his hand, noting that he shouldn't care what he needed the black fat for, and said that he would buy the product if Hun had it, and if he didn't, he should leave and not interfere with the man's business. When the man lowered the edge of the newspaper he was holding, the paper folded, and Hun was able to read that 1 milliliter of black thick fat was equal to 83 coins. This meant that 1 liter would be equal to 83,000 coins, and he didn't even expect that someone would buy the black fat at such a high price. Smiling faintly, he stepped aside, adjusting his hood, and noticed that he had found a way to strike it rich, because according to the ancient dragon's records, the slime from the surface of the black octopus, the resin of the dark oak tree and the thickener were mixed in a ratio of 3:1:2 at a high temperature for 75 minutes, and thus a black thick fat was obtained. Although the records also said that the dark tree that produced the black resin had long since died out, however, such a thing was not uncommon on the black market, and the protagonist resolutely clenched his fist, realizing that he only had to figure out the thickeners, and in this case he could make money. Soon he was back home and, having set the necessary devices on the table, he began to cook, and, having waited for the right moment, he asked Lizard to press the pedal twice. It obeyed, following the order, and the fire burned brighter, and after a while, everything was finally ready and Hung poured the last ingredients into the cauldron, thinking that among the 13 departments of the 5 bureaus where the Black Lanterns were assembled, there was one institution with a special status, which was called the Dangerous Biological and Energy Research Department. The function of these departments was to study dangerous creatures and strange energy phenomena, and the research department managed 3 institutes that purchased black thick fat in bulk. Opening a small tap, Hung began to pour the finished black fat into special flasks, noting that although selling it could bring in a lot of money, but if he immediately flooded the market with so much black fat, he would have to be very careful so that the secrets of the ancient dragon were not discovered. He frowned in concentration, pressing his lips tightly together and putting the flasks he had made into one box. Not only was the black tree a rare species, but it also grew extremely slowly, and some herbivorous species liked to eat the young branches and leaves of black trees, making it very rare to find plants taller than a meter. No more than a few dozen milliliters could be harvested from a single meter-tall black tree per year, so the sudden appearance of a large quantity of goods on the black market would definitely attract other people's attention, and Hung frowned even more, realizing that it would be best to find a store, sell the black fat, and run away. Some time later, he, wearing a cloak and hiding his face with a hood, had already gone out into the street and carefully looked around, passing between other people, and finally noticed the Hong trading house, realizing that he needed to go there. Entering, he dumped several flasks on the counter, announcing that there were 30 liters, and calculating that the price of this would be 250,000 coins, he asked the saleswoman if she would buy it. The woman shuddered, noticing the flasks, and smiling excitedly, she exclaimed that of course she would buy it, and asked where Hung got so much from. He, taking out a dagger, leaned sharply towards her, pressing the blade of the knife to her throat, and seriously said that she had better not ask about it. The woman, looking at the weapon with horror, promised that she would not do this, and soon Hung had already left the store, slamming the door behind him, and throwing a few coins in his palm. He noted that this money cannot be spent now, but it is better to go to the fortress and exchange a small amount of ingredients, and also wait until everything calms down. At the same time, he was going to meet his teammates, and headed towards the castle. Around this time, in the castle, Wangsun said that he knew Hung, saying that they had participated in special training together. He was an average person with no taming talents, so no one could even imagine that the castle master himself would pay attention to him and take him as a disciple. He assumed that it was luck. Sun was a tamer and participated in special training with the protagonist, and was also the first among all the participants to successfully hatch an egg. His controlled beast was an adult mid-danger level mountain lion. Luo Chong, dissatisfied, slammed his hand on the table and said that Hung was very lucky, because the castle master wanted him to be the captain in the competition. He was a tamer from a rich family, had good talent, and had several controlled beasts, including a mid-danger level red scaly dinosaur, as well as a mid-danger level blood ox in its final stage. Reina came closer and said that last year Lu Han was the captain. Even though he only ranked 4th and couldn't enter the secret room, he was still very strong, and before him Su was the captain, and she became the champion in the 6th competition. Reina was a tamer, and she was currently the strongest. She also had several beasts under her control, namely the iron magic trees of the middle danger level, as well as the sleeping butterflies of the middle danger level. Lane Yusin smiled and asked, "Is there anyone among them who doubts the master's decision?" She pointed out that not to mention them, even their teacher would not dare to disobey the master, and said that they were all familiar with him, but they had to admit that they underestimated him, since his main pet is the snake dragon lizard of the highest danger level. None of them had a pet of even a high danger level, and she asked if that was not enough to explain their breakup with him. Indignant, Chong stood up from his seat, looking towards Yusin, but before he could say anything else, Fu opened the door and invited Heng into the hall, saying that he was busy, but his comrades had already arrived. He asked that he meet them, and leading Hung to the table, he told them not to be shy, introduce themselves to each other and chat, and he himself decided to leave so as not to disturb the young people. Everyone present in the hall stood up, bidding Fu farewell, and soon he left, closing the door behind him. Sun, smiling, soon sat back down and said that their captain had arrived. Reina, laughing, agreed with this, noting that their captain only had one beast. Heng, hearing these ridicule, pressed his lips tighter, lowered his gaze, but did not say anything, and because of this, the atmosphere in the room was quite oppressive. Suddenly, Yusin attracted the protagonist's attention and, with a kind smile, she said her name, saying that she became a tamer a little over a year ago, and now she is officially a tamer. Currently, she only had 2 pets, namely, a mid-danger level flower ghost tiger and a mid-danger level electric swallow. She stood up from her seat, stretching out her palm towards Hen, and he, also saying his name, said that he became a tamer 2 months ago, and now he is officially a tamer. He only had 1 pet, namely, a snake dragon, which is a top danger level lizard. He shook Yusin's hand, and Chong, who also stood up from his seat, suddenly apologized, saying that it was cool to officially become a tamer in 2 months, and especially if his first pet was a snake dragon of the highest danger level. Hung looked at him, and admitted that Chong was right, because Hung himself was much better than him. Chong got angry when he heard this, and clenched his jaw, asking if the protagonist was really saying that he was stronger than him. He offered to test it, and stretched out his hand forward, calling out a red-scaled dinosaur. The monster appeared in front of him, turning over several chairs and a table, and placing his palm on the monster's back. Chong looked at Hung and asked if he was really scared. The protagonist grabbed his chin with his hand, clenched his teeth, and thought that compared to this huge monster, the snake dragon lizard really has little chance of winning. However, according to the ancient laws of the dragon, in competitions, if a person cannot crush the opponent, then he must kill himself against the wall. Relaxing a little, he looked at Chong and admitted that his pet's cultivation was quite good, but it seemed that it was not a species of the highest danger level. Shrugging his shoulders, he asked, "Does Chong not have the same?" Yusin laughed with her hand over her mouth, and Chong furiously shouted Heng's name, but before he could do anything else, Reina came closer to him, stretching out her palm in front of him, saying that this meeting was arranged by the master of the castle, and advised him to think about the consequences. Chong flinched, frowning in displeasure, and Hung, smiling, told them not to worry, since the owner of the castle would not scold them. However, because Chong summoned the beast directly into the castle, he did not know what the garrison would do to him, and crossed his arms over his chest, smirking. Chong only cried out in displeasure, putting away his pet, and then, looking furiously at the protagonist, he said that he had better not face him in the competition in a month. Hung looked at him seriously, admitting that he did not even have the desire to unite in order to fight for the honor of the Black Lanterns. Turning around, he opened the door, leaving the room, and admitted that it would be better if he did not offend such teammates. He slammed the doors behind him with a bang, and frowning in displeasure, Chong asked, "What was that?" Sun smiled and told him not to worry, noting that they would have another chance to deal with the main man. Hung meanwhile climbed the stairs, remembering that he said that they would go to the grizzly forest tomorrow. These disgruntled comrades, as far as he could tell, were also part of his test for him, and the protagonist was a little worried about this. He realized that he needed to take full advantage of this special training, and decided that once he returned, he would become a captain. After climbing to the very top, he sat on the edge of the fence, thinking. The next morning, some people approached Heng's house, one of whom knocked on the door and announced that he was the head of the Black Lantern Guards, Zhang Qing, who would be accompanying him on a special training in the grizzly forest. Hearing this, Heng asked Qing and his comrades to come in, and after entering, Qing spread a map on the table, telling him that this was where their black fire was located. Heng, looking intently at the map, listened attentively to the information, and Qing, pointing to one of the places on the map, said that this small settlement near the Himalayan bear forest was called the Iron Village. The distance to the Iron Village was only about 150 kilometers, but only half of the way was on a repaired road, so in fact, the route was quite winding. In addition, they could encounter troubles along the way, and therefore, most likely, the road to the desired place should have taken 1 or 2 days. The protagonist, frowning, put his hand to his chin, agreeing with this information, and Cheng, smiling, asked if he had any questions. Heng said that he had no questions and said that he was ready to go. Soon the car was already driving along the desired road, and the protagonist, continuing to study the map, thought that the black fire was in the Grey Desert, just like the Iron Village and the Grizzly Forest. It was a vast area with dozens of large settlements, as well as many smaller settlements and nomad camps. After a while, they stopped near a tower, and Qing asked Heng to wait for a while he himself was going to go and report their arrival to the tea house, since they were going to rest there in the evening. The protagonist happily agreed to this, and the next moment, using a walkie-talkie, Cha-Nam, who was sitting at the top of the watchtower, contacted Qing, announcing that the deputy mayor of the tea house was speaking to them, and asking if they were a team from the Black Lantern. Qing, also taking the walkie-talkie, said that he was the commander of the 5th Tactical Group of the bodyguards of the 1st and 3rd Squads of the Black Lantern, gave his name, and seriously explained that they needed to enter the city in order to rest and recuperate. Cha-Nam asked him to say the last password, and taking a small piece of paper, Qing read out a combination of numbers and letters, which was the password. Soon the gate opened and Cha-Nam came out of the tower with 2 warriors and praised Qing for his good work. Qing smiled when he saw Cha-Nam and noted that he was in a good mood. He also said that he had brought a dear guest with him this time, and asked him to arrange a good place for them to stay. Cha-Nam asked him to rely on him and asked them to enter, pointing his hand towards the entrance. Soon they were already inside the castle, and pointing to the large chests, someone said that these were items for taming animals, prepared especially for him. After that, Cheng, closing his eyes, pointed to Chinhan, calling his name, and explained that he would be a private for the protagonist. Hung agreed with this and thanked them for their work, and then told Lizard to come out. The dragon appeared behind him, and, noticing that it was already waiting, the protagonist stroked the dragon, telling it to go already and have something to eat. Chen and Han were equally amazed, covered in sweat from excitement, and at the same time asked themselves, is this really the animal that Hung tamed? Turning to the side, they noticed that the protagonist did not open the canned food, and assumed that Lizard would eat it along with the box. However, the next moment, they suddenly shuddered, opening their eyes wider, as they noticed that Lizard, having opened its mouth, released magical energy, and the cans filled with food rose from the box, opened, and the food went towards the dragon. Lizard raised its head to more conveniently eat the food falling into its mouth, and having taken enough food, it slightly narrowed its eyes, looking at Chang and Han who were watching this, who, noticing this looked at each other and excitedly asked themselves if it was true that Lizard despised them. In the end, distracted from these emotions, Han attracted Heng's attention and said that the tea house was different from the Black Lantern, since there was no curfew here, and the nightlife was quite rich. Some of the tea house companions invited them to have fun with them at a bar on the mountain, and he asked what Hung thought about it. The protagonist told them to have fun, but he himself decided not to go, but asked them to find him a guide if possible, since he wanted to walk around the city. And suddenly Lena, opening the door, entered the room and smiling, asked if Hung really needed a guide. Everyone in the room shuddered, looking at her in amazement, and she, looking back at them in fear, cried out, apologizing, and explained that she did not intend to eavesdrop on their conversation, noting that it was Chanam's grandfather who asked her to bring them souvenirs from the tea house. Han, also apologizing, said that he could confirm that Lena was indeed Chanam's granddaughter, and added that if the protagonist needed a guide, then she was the best one. Coming closer to Lena, he put his hand on her shoulder, and smiling and closing his eyes, Hung said that it was wonderful, thanking her for her help. She confidently frowned, smiling, and also agreed with this. Soon the two of them were already out on the streets of the city, and while Hung walked, thoughtfully holding his chin with his hand, Lena smiled, walking next to him, and pointed her hand in different directions, telling about the city. Such architecture as in the tea monastery could not be seen anywhere else, and it was very different from what was in the Black Lantern. Most of the roofs of the houses were in the shape of a triangle, and the houses themselves could be square or rectangular, and this created the impression of volume. According to tradition, the residents of the tea monastery painted the walls of their houses in black and brown, and according to Lena, there are hundreds of such buildings. All the houses and shops in the town were located on the slopes, and a little higher up in the mountains there was a tiny castle made of stones and earth. It was the first building in the tea abode, and the local government met here. Hung imagined this castle, and was suddenly distracted from his thoughts, as Lena, pulling at the edge of his cloak, attracted his attention, remembered something, and told him that they would be holding animal fights tonight, asking if he would like to watch. The protagonist smiled a little enthusiastically and asked if she was talking about animal fights. Lena explained that soldiers and civilians sometimes caught wild animals and then held fighting competitions in the arena with the participation of these animals, and this attracted many spectators. She imagined two monsters that fought against each other in the arena, and added that if an animal was injured or died in the fight, then its meat did not go to waste, and it was used as food for the people of the town. She smiled enthusiastically as she told this, and remembered that today they would bring a special beast that no one had ever seen in the tea house before, and this monster would fight an adult tiger. She knew that many people would come to watch the fight, and pointed with her palm at the men and women who were already approaching the gate of the arena. Hung thought about it, frowning and holding his chin in his hand, and noted that although the tiger was an ordinary beast, it was incredibly ferocious, so watching the fight would be useful for Lizard. In the end, he agreed to go and watch, and Lena was very happy to hear these words. They went to the ticket office, buying 2 tickets to enter the arena, and Balrena, who handed them the tickets, looked at Hung and, attracting Lena's attention, asked if this was really her boyfriend. She didn't know who he was and called him a cute boy, asking if he wasn't from around here. Besides, she wondered why she hadn't seen him in the tea house before. Lena got angry when she heard those words and frowned, asking Balrena not to say stupid things. Taking the protagonist's hand, she began to drag him away from the cash register, asking him to hurry up. Balrena looked at them with a smile, and Hung awkwardly put his hand to his forehead and smiled, closing his eyes. Soon, they arrived at the arena itself, and the people they passed recognized Lena, happy that she had come too. Someone gave up their seat for her, intending to sit somewhere else, and Lena thanked the person with a welcoming wave and closing her eyes, but said that it would be inconvenient for her to take that seat today, so she decided that she would take advantage of the offer next time. Hung looked at her with a smile, thinking that she was a celebrity here. Suddenly, Lad appeared in front of them, smiling and asking who he saw. He said that Lena had taken the time to visit him, and she, frowning seriously, said that she had only come to escort an important guest, so it would be good if he found a better place for them, otherwise she would complain to grandfather. Hung smiled excitedly at this seriousness, and Lad looked at the protagonist and asked if this was really the young man. He smiled, nodded and placed his hand on Lena's head, and Lad, noticing Hang's hand, opened his eyes wide, startled, because he noticed the ring of the Lord on his finger. He realized that it was better not to quarrel with such a person, and greeting him, invited him to the arena of the tea monastery. The main character greeted him, and very soon several guys blew a horn, and the girl host, coming out into the arena, attracted the attention of the spectators, announcing that their animal fights would begin right now. She was glad to see everyone and greeted everyone here, raising her hand to the side. The spectators in the stands rejoiced, shouting, and the girl, pointing her hand towards the cage located to the side of her, said, as everyone expected, the city guard brought a tiger from the jungle, whose body length was more than 3 meters, and weighed more than 600 kilograms. The huge tiger was really behind bars, and roared, frowning furiously. One of the guys, seeing this, assumed that this tiger was in excellent fighting shape and was eager to start the fight. His companion sitting next to him looked at the arena with enthusiasm, saying that the traps created by the Ase trapper were the most powerful weapons in the tea house. One of the guys frowned in displeasure, asking when the fight would start already. Lena also joined in the shouting, waving her hand, wishing everyone good luck. Hung simply stood next to her, holding a cup of hot drink in his hands, and watched her, and at that moment, the host, frowning in concentration, asked the audience to be patient and allow them to introduce today's participant. Pointing her hand to the side, she said that this was the second fighter. She admitted that she had never seen such a strange arena, and expressed her hope that this captured beast would surprise everyone. One of the assistants threw forward a small metal box, the sides of which were a grid, and when the box fell to the ground, the top lid of it flew to the side, and from it stuck out its head a small monster, who practically cried and froze, disoriented. At that very moment, the doors of the cage in which the tiger was sitting opened, and the animal, coming forward, focused on its opponent, who, shuddering, cried, noticing the tiger. Instantly jumping out of the cage, the monster tried to climb the wall to climb up. The spectators watching this laughed, and one of them drew attention to how this monster ran, confessing that he saw such a strange creature for the first time. Unlike the rest of the spectators who were laughing and smiling, the main character suddenly froze, frowning, and shuddering, wondering if this was really what he was thinking. At this point, the tiger growled, preparing to start the fight, and jumped into the air, heading towards the small beast to attack it, and in response to this action, the monster, crying only harder, could only scream and try to run away. The monster pressed itself against the bars of the closed cage in fear, trying to escape somewhere, and closed its eyes in despair. However, when the tiger ran closer to it, the beast jumped away at high speed. The tiger, because of this, only became more angry and prepared for the next attack, slowly approaching the beast frozen in place and trembling with horror. The spectators were tense when they watched the fight, and one of them was shocked at how fast this beast moved. His companion sitting next to him was amazed at what had happened, as he thought that the tiger would smash the beast like a fly on a table. The boy sitting next to his mother exclaimed that it was cool and asked her what kind of beast it was. His mother simply placed her hand on his shoulder, continuing to watch the battle, and Hung thought that according to ancient legends, there were 4 incredibly dangerous rare species of dragons, and because of their power, these species were called the 4 gods. He thought about it, pressing his lips tighter and recalling the information he needed, and noted that these species included the mysterious species, the fairy species, the miraculous species, and the mythical species. He imagined the monsters that could represent each of these species, and leaning forward a little so that he could see the beast better, he thought that such speed and reaction were definitely not typical of an ordinary beast. He noticed the golden mark on the animal's forehead, the rounded shape of its body, and realized that this beast belonged to a mysterious species, and dragons of this species were natural-born treasure hunters. The dragon at this time, with its eyes closed and crying, tried to escape from the tiger that was chasing it. Hung continued to think and noted that treasure hunters were extremely dangerous, but almost not aggressive, and these beasts had a rare ability of a mysterious species. In addition, such dragons were quite rare, and as the name suggested, these monsters were born to search for treasures, which they fed on. Traces of such dragons could only be seen in very dangerous places, so Hung found it unexpected to see such a dragon here. He decided that he could not miss this opportunity, and seriously attracting Lena's attention, he admitted that he wanted to know something, and asked if he could buy this beast. He pointed his finger at the arena, and Lena told him that Lad had bought the beast from the head winemaker of the Chan Naim Tea Monastery. She also added that Lad was the owner of the tea monastery arena, and all the battle beasts there belonged to him, so he could try to negotiate with him. Hung smiled upon learning this information, and asked Lena to take him to Lad. Soon they arrived at the office and went inside, and Lad, with Lena standing next to him, holding his hand, admitted that he was afraid that it was impossible, and even if the protagonist was her friend, he could not agree to this request. He understood that she knew that the rules of the battle could not be violated, since it could not be stopped until one of the opponents was defeated. Lena continued to look at him pleadingly, asking him to agree after all, and Lad, sweating slightly from excitement, looked at her and waving his free hand that Lena was not holding, he said that it was not about money at all. She frowned, noting that she knew he had bought the beast from Naim for 1,000 steel coins, and said that she would pay 4,000, asking if that was a good deal. Lad closed his eyes, smiling, and did not argue further, but noted that Lena should understand that no one in his family had ever broken the rules of the arena for fighting beasts. Hung finally chimed in and asked if it was true that Lad was worried about the bets already made and the tickets sold. Lad looked at him seriously, noting that as far as he knew, the beast was not that valuable, and asked if he really cared about getting this one. The protagonist asked Lad not to misunderstand him and said that he really wanted this beast, but he did not want to break the rules, and that was why he had a proposal, and he, smiling enthusiastically, asked if Lad would listen to this. Very soon, a voice came from the loudspeakers located in the arena, attracting the attention of the spectators and announcing that due to an emergency, they were forced to stop the fight. The spectators immediately began to be indignant, shouting that they bought tickets, enjoyed the spectacle, and someone even threatened that he would not come again if the fight did not continue. Lad, holding a microphone in his hands, asked the spectators to calm down and listen to him, noting that firstly, the cost of the tickets would be returned to all those present 3 times the amount, and the bets made would be returned in full. Secondly, there was going to be an incredible battle in the arena today, and Lena, who was sitting next to him, smiled enthusiastically, and Lad invited the audience to welcome the new disciple Hun. The protagonist walked out of the corridor leading to the arena, and noticing this, the audience immediately became happy, and one of the guys asked, "Is it really possible for a man to fight a beast?" He tried to remember how many years had passed since the last such battle, and his comrade, who was sitting next to him, was amazed at what Lad was able to do. The tiger, noticing the new opponent, growled furiously, narrowed his eyes, and looked at Heng, and then ran forward, ready to attack him. The protagonist stood still, not moving, and the audience became worried, assuming that Heng was about to die. The mother closed her child's eyes, excitedly watching what was happening in the arena, and Lena, also worried, clenched her fists, shouting that Heng would definitely win. He remained calm and smirking, extended his palm, ordering his snake microphone to come out. Lizard, wrapped in magical energy, appeared in front of him, threateningly opening its mouth, and noticing a new opponent, the tiger froze, frightened, and slightly pressed itself to the ground, trembling, and the spectators only rejoiced even more, realizing that Heng is the master, and noticing that he has a dangerous type of dragon. Many were delighted with what they saw, since the last time they saw the master was in the tea monastery 3 months ago, and now they understood that they came here today for a reason. Lena greeted Heng with her arms raised in joy, and Heng, hearing her cry, smiled, looked in her direction, and made an approving gesture with his finger. While Lena watched him with admiration, Lad froze, his eyes wide in amazement, and noticed that the protagonist was so young, and already controlled the most dangerous creatures. Taking out a small handkerchief, he wiped the sweat that appeared on his face and smiled excitedly, glad that he was polite enough to Heng. After that, he thoughtfully and smilingly looked at Lena, who began waving her arms again, and assumed that this time she had a new friend. Lizard, meanwhile, appeared next to Heng, spreading its wings wide, showing its power, and the protagonist himself ordered it to attack. Lizard opened his mouth slightly, and streams of magical energy began to gather next to it, gradually heading towards the tiger, who, shuddering, sat down, cried and trembled, opening his mouth wide in horror. Closing his eyes, the tiger suddenly found a tablet on which he admitted his guilt and mistake, and asked that no one kill him. It held the tablet in front of him, trembling only more, and then, not feeling any attack, the tiger shuddered, opening his eyes wide, and looked with surprise at the fact that Heng and Lizard's attention was not directed at this, but at the other dragon, who began to run from side to side, closing his eyes in despair. The tiger looked at the other dragon in bewilderment, and Heng, holding his chin with his hand, drew attention to the speed and rapidity of this one's reaction, assuming that this is due to his physical form, and noted that it is not for nothing that this dragon is called a mysterious creature. He urged Lizard to attack the dragon and extended his palm forward, frowning in concentration. Lizard flew forward, and the other dragon, noticing this, first froze, shuddering, and then began to run faster, crying in terror. Heng, smirking, told Lizard to use the second stage of acceleration power, and Lizard also accelerated, looking intently at the enemy in front of him. Clouds appeared in the air around it, and Lizard only flew forward faster, stretching out its paws in order to be able to grab the dragon. The distance between the two dragons was closing, and the monster screamed in terror, continuing to run. Having caught up with it, Lizard tried to strike, but the monster managed to dodge and jump to the side, avoiding this attack. Heng did not give up and clenching his fist, activated the dragon's power of the second-level strike. A huge amount of magical energy appeared around Lizard, which began to twist around it in a spiral, rising high into the air above the arena. The spectators froze, opening their mouths, and admitted that they were very scared. Many were amazed at the power of the ruler, and someone noted that if the beast Hung met in a fight with a detachment of soldiers, there would be nothing left of the soldiers. The dragon, also frightened by Lizard's attack, cried, screaming pitifully, and Lizard stretched out his paw to it, and this time the dragon did not run away, since it could not move. Lizard, despite its threatening appearance, carefully lifted the dragon, and Hung, stopping next to it, asked, "Can it really not run away?" The dragon screamed again, and then doomedly closed its eyes, lowering its head. Soon, in the office of the owner of the beast fighting arena, Lad, in front of whom Hung and Lena were standing, admitted that it was amazing, calling the protagonist a lord. It was the first time he saw such a young person tame fierce beasts, and Hung tried to refuse this praise, smiled, apologizing for his tactlessness, and asked how Lad managed to catch such a fast animal. He placed his palm on the small cage in which the dragon was sitting, and Lad, closing his eyes, also pointed his finger at the animal, asking if Hung really meant this. He explained that for the Black Lantern, the tea monastery was not only an important supply point in the south, but also a major supplier of wine products, and it was due to the skill of their residents in winemaking that the tea monastery attracted the attention of the Black Lantern, after which it was accepted as a vassal. The one who caught this beast was an old winemaker from the monastery, whose name was Naim. Lad remembered someone saying that this beast had gotten into the wine cellar and ruined several barrels that were meant for the head of the Black Lantern. He imagined the dragon, having overturned a barrel from which wine began to spill, starting to run away, as an angry Naim noticed this disgrace. For a week, Naim and his apprentices did nothing about the dragon, but one day the winemaker, having already lost all hope that everything would resolve itself, found a drunk and peacefully sleeping beast in a barrel. He imagined Naim, frowning furiously, approaching the barrel on the edge of which the sleeping beast hung, and frowned. Telling this, Lad smiled, pointing with his palms at the cage, and said that after this incident Naim sold the beast to him. Slightly worried, Hung said that despite its own mysterious power, the beast was so stupid that it got drunk, and therefore it was no wonder that it was caught. The dragon was ashamed, hearing these words, and bowed its head, closing its eyes, and a little later, near the threshold of the house where Hung now lived, it stopped, smiled and said that Lena had helped him a lot this time, so now he was in her debt. She, embarrassedly closing her eyes, said that she did not need gratitude, since she thought that all this was nonsense. She also added that she heard that the protagonist would continue his journey tomorrow, and therefore noted that now he needed to have a good rest. Hung promised that he would do so, and said that next time he would bring Lena something interesting from the Black Lantern. He went up to his room, putting the cage with the dragon on the table in front of him, and, looking seriously at the monster in the box, he asked with displeasure, "What does all this mean?" Having burst into tears, the beast shuddered, looking at Hung with horror, and he, continuing to maintain a serious expression on his face, warned that if he had not saved the dragon then in the arena, then it would have been dead long ago. The beast's horror disappeared, and it simply looked sadly at the protagonist, hugging the bars of the cage with its paws. Having looked closely at the structure of the cage, Hung noticed that the bars of this one were no thicker than a little finger, and if it had been a snake dragon, then it would have easily broken the cage and escaped. Now he realized that aggression was indeed alien to representatives of the mysterious species, and stuck his fingers between the bars of the cage, stroking the dragon's cheek. It, although still crying, did not resist, and the protagonist thought that now he would have to take care of it, and then noticed that in the ancient dragon books there was no information about what this beast ate. However, he thought of something and, smiling, put his finger to his chin, deciding that the dragon would starve with him for a few days, and in that case it would no longer care what exactly it ate. The dragon shuddered in horror when he heard this, but Hing did not pay attention to it, and turned a little to the side, smiling smugly. Suddenly, the ring on his finger began to shine, and noticing this, Hung cursed, frowning, because he realized that he had been so busy that he had completely forgotten to feed the lizard. Stepping aside a little, he picked up one of the boxes filled with cans of food and, inhaling from the effort, put the box on the table near the cage where the dragon was sitting. After that, taking a large bowl, he began to pour food into it, and noticing this food, the beast frowned enthusiastically, stretching its paws to its face. Having finished pouring the food, Hung began to stir it, smiling faintly, and from how much the dragon liked the sight of it, even saliva flowed from its mouth. The protagonist, smiling even more, turned to Lizard, noting that if it ate 3 times more than usual, then they would be able to get enough iron to reach the village by tomorrow evening. The beast continued to look at the food with delight, and Hung, activating the ring, called Lizard, who appeared behind him and, narrowing his eyes contentedly, immediately began to eat. The dragon was disappointed, realizing that the food was not meant for it, and burst into tears, and Hung, hearing the plaintive sounds it made, shuddered, looking at the dragon in surprise, and noticed that it turned its back to him with resentment, hiding its tears. Leaning closer to the cage, the protagonist smiled and asked if it really wanted to eat too. The beast nodded, and Hung took the spoon with which he had previously mixed the food, and putting it in the bowl, scooped up some food. Lizard, noticing Hung's behavior, shuddered in bewilderment, opening his eyes wider, but the protagonist did not pay attention to this and brought the spoon to the beast, telling it to eat. The dragon began to eat the food with pleasure, closing his eyes, and Lizard was horrified, noticing this. It even looked up from its food and, shuddering, opened its mouth and opened its eyes wider, watching the dragon eat the food. Hung, smiling, also watched this, admitting to himself that he did not even think that the treasure hunter would like the same food as the snake dragon. Now he understood that the beast would definitely not remain hungry, and very soon the spoon was already lowered, and the beast looked with delight and hope at the protagonist, who, assuming that it wanted more, asked it to wait a little, and turned towards the bowl where the food lay, but froze, shuddering, and frowned, since Lizard, having eaten everything in an instant, froze next to the plate, sighing smugly and closing his eyes. Hung warned Lizard that if necessary, it would eat less so that there would be enough for this and the other dragon. Lizard was angry when he found out about this and frowned in annoyance. However, Hung was not impressed and lightly hit Lizard on the head, warning him that it was now the older brother and therefore should behave appropriately. The dragon closed its eyes when it received the blow, and Hung asked it to behave more calmly, exclaiming that both dragons would have a good time today. The next morning, Lena, standing on one of the towers, waved goodbye to Hung, who went to the Iron Village. This village was much larger than the tea monastery, and there was an ironworks where people mined iron, copper, and aluminum. Hung sat in the car, studying the information he had, and remembered that it seemed like someone had said that the village was somehow dependent on the grizzly forest. However, because of the law, Ching could not say this directly, so all Hung could do was wait for him to arrive and figure it out for himself. During the journey, he looked at Ching several times, trying to get him to explain, but he just smiled excitedly, saying nothing. Finally, they approached the village, and upon entering it, Hung immediately felt the smog. The air was filled with the smell of burnt steel, smelted from coal, and upon arriving at the village, Ching sent Hung to the center of the village for a leadership meeting. He led him to a tall building, pointing to one of the towers of it, and at that moment, the protagonist finally understood what Ching was silent about. The Iron Village turned out to be a backwater city with a civilian population of 1,000 people and 150 soldiers. On paper, it was an independent settlement in the Grey Desert, but in reality it was subordinate to the Black Lantern and supplied it with metal and agricultural products. However, there was something more important, because the minerals here were mined in the Grizzly Forest, which was an impossible dream for ordinary people, and the reason why the Iron Village could freely mine the minerals from this place shocked him, because the forest turned out to be his property, or more accurately, his pet's territory. Thinking about this, the protagonist imagined he, whose silhouette towered over the forest, and noted that he was even able to control all the bears in the forest to some extent with his pet. Soon, he went up to the conference room of the committee management, and drank wine with Chang and another man. While the men were talking, he walked over to the window and looked out into it, thinking. He sighed, noting that he had assumed that he was unusually strong, but he did not think that he was this strong. According to the management committee, there were 4 overlords in the Grizzly Forest at the moment, and the strongest of these overlords was the old Black Lantern fighter, the so-called professional commander, but the other 3 overlords were not so simple either, because their strength level was higher than that of an experienced fighter. Heng pressed his lips in concentration, thinking that although all of these people belonged to the Black Lantern, he still felt uneasy. After a while, he went to his room, and the lizard, lying on the floor, soon fell asleep with its head on its paws, and Hung sat at the table, stroking the beast that sat opposite him. He thought that pets were no less important than money and power, and noted that it would be stupid to go to the Grizzly Forest and ask the Overlord to recognize the treasure hunter. He knew that the best way to do this was different, and while attracting the dragon's attention, Hung smiled, asking if it would be his companion. The beast looked at him in confusion, screamed, and looked down uncertainly, and the protagonist became nervous when he saw such a reaction, and laughed, asking the dragon to forget about it, offering to eat first, and then talk some more. Hearing about food, Lizard woke up, raising his head sharply, and noticing this, Hung even shuddered in surprise. Soon they started eating, and noticing the behavior of the two dragons, the protagonist indignantly asked what they were doing. He suggested that they do without talking, ordering both dragons to eat properly. Having received an interesting beast, Hung, who was planning to immediately go to the grizzly forest, eventually decided to stay in the tea town for another 3 days. The reason was simple and was that he needed to find a way to establish a mental connection with the beast looking for treasure, so that it would belong to him. Hung imagined a dragon surrounded by a magic circle and positioned next to the ring. However, it was not as easy as it seemed at first glance, and every time Hung tried to establish a mental connection, he was repelled by the beast's consciousness. He tried several times, enclosing the dragon in a sphere of magical energy and concentrating with his eyes closed. But even after rummaging through the old dragon codex, he could not find any relevant records. Therefore, Hung came up with one stupid way and, sharply raising his hand forward, he addressed the animal sitting in the backpack behind his back and asked, "Isn't this a treasure hunter?" He confidently shouted that he would take it with him to search for treasure. However, unfortunately, everything was not as simple as Hung thought, and closing his eyes, he soon irritably called the dragon a name, asking, "What about searching for treasure?" He placed it on the boxes in front of him and, clenching his jaws, looked at it with displeasure, and noted that it had been chasing butterflies and beetles all morning, asking if it was a child. The beast, clinging to the box, also frowned with displeasure, and the protagonist, looking at it threateningly, said that if he found out that it was an ordinary animal, he would feed it to Lizard, and asked if the dragon agreed with this. The beast screamed in fear, and then, closing his eyes, activated magical energy, and concentrated, and then, dispersing the aura around himself, it pointed a finger to the side, screaming to attract attention. Hung was delighted, assuming that the dragon had found the treasure, and turned to look in the direction it was pointing, but noticing that the beast was pointing to the advertisement for the Surabaya hormone drink, he cried out indignantly and asked if the dragon really wanted to say that it had caught the scent of treasure here. He looked at it with disbelief, and the beast, closing its eyes, nodded confidently, crying out. The protagonist put his hand on his chin, thinking, and noticed that this time magical energy was seething in the dragon's body. He grinned faintly, and then suddenly said that he did not want to go to that place, since it could be another setup, and so he decided to go home and feed the lizard. He picked up the dragon in his arms, starting to move away, and it cried out in protest, closed its eyes and began waving its hand, pointing to the side. Hung assumed that the beast wanted to go there, and also thought that there was a treasure there. The beast confirmed this, and Hung asked why he should help it get this treasure. The dragon shuddered in bewilderment, looking at the protagonist, and then looked down pitifully, almost crying. Hung suddenly added that he liked to do good deeds, but said that the beast should promise him one thing. The dragon screamed, raising its head and listening to him, and imagining a collar and a whip, it only became more upset, and Hung, laughing, asked if the beast was really worried about this. Closing his eyes, he said that this was just a mental connection, not submission, and the beast looked at him in bewilderment, and then, frowning decisively, screamed, putting forward a paw clenched into a fist. Hung in response lightly hit the beast's fist with his fist, declaring that they had agreed. Soon they walked towards the desired establishment, and Hung thought that without the foundation of affection, it was impossible to establish a mental connection overnight, and if he simply offered it to the dragon, it would refuse. However, establishing a mental connection when the beast did not resist changed everything radically, and the protagonist was happy about it. At the same time, in the establishment, opening a special bottle for mixing, the bartender placed a filled glass in front of the girl and said that this was their signature drink that she ordered. The girl smiled, pleased with this, and soon Hung entered the establishment, opening the door. The guy greeted him, asking if he would like to drink their signature drink hormone? But the protagonist said that he just came to look around, and the bartender looked at him in confusion, and then frowned in anger, asking himself, did Hung really come to the pub in the middle of the day just to look around? He looked suspicious to him, and leaning towards the guards, he warned that he was seeing the protagonist for the first time, assuming that he could be a foreign mercenary or a relative of one of the soldiers. He ordered the guards to watch Hung, and in the meantime, he went to a stone standing a little to the side inside the building, and asked if this was a treasure. The beast screamed, pointing its paw towards it, and Hung, squinting his eyes in displeasure, looked at the dragon and asked if this was a treasure hunter or a garbage collector. The beast indignantly closed its eyes, and the stone suddenly began to mutate, and the shape of it completely changed. Noticing this, Hung shuddered, slightly embarrassed, and mentally exclaimed that this could not be what the old dragon code said. However, he realized that it was a shape-shifting stone, and noted that the dragon beast transformation path was full of difficulties and unnecessary, and the demand for evolutionary materials was even higher. Transformation stones were the main material needed to transform a very strong dragon species on the dragon transformation path. He put up a huge monster, and admitted to himself that he never thought that he would ever encounter something he had never dreamed of. Stroking the dragon sitting on his shoulder, he thanked it in his mind, asking if it was true that this was a real treasure-hunting mage. He even cried with happiness, and suddenly the bartender, coming closer to him, displeasedly attracted his attention and asked why he was standing. He was wondering if Hung was a guest or a troublemaker, and upon hearing his voice, the protagonist startled, turning his attention to him, and then smiled, turning towards the bartender, and warning that he wanted to buy this stone. He asked how much it cost. The dragon on his shoulder also smiled, and the bartender startled, surprised by such a request. Frowning in confusion, he asked, did Hung really want to buy this piece of stone? He lowered his head slightly, thinking that this stone was found by the boss in the ruins of the wilderness. However, even after several experts looked at this stone, they all found it useless except for the curvature, and the stone was not used for any other purpose, so it was used here as a decoration. However, if that was the case, he didn't know if other customers would think that their bar lacks style. Finally making a decision, he closed his eyes, started waving his palm, and said that it was a very expensive stone, offering Hung a treat to drink and leave, since he didn't think he could afford it. But the protagonist, smiling, simply told the bartender to tell him the price, and pointing his finger at the stone, he shouted that Hung could have the stone right away for 10,000 steel coins. The protagonist took out a few gold coins and threw it on the table next to the bartender, saying that this would be enough. Pressing his lips tightly, the bartender even became slightly embarrassed, and his cheeks turned red, and he mentally exclaimed that this was a lot. The guards, who were also sitting nearby, shuddered, amazed by the number of coins, and Hung, looking seriously at the bartender, extended his hand forward, saying that he had given them more than what he had offered, but they still had to deliver the stone for him. Looking closely at his hand, the bartender noticed the master's ring, and shuddered in fear, and then, kneeling down with the guards, began to bow, apologizing for not realizing that it was the master tamer who had visited his bar. He was sure that the stone would be delivered, and exclaimed that he had simply indicated the wrong price, since in fact the price was only 1 gold coin. The protagonist, still frowning seriously, said that the masters were making every effort to protect it, and expressed the hope that such a thing would not happen to him, or anyone else again. The boys promised that this would never happen again, and Hung soon left the bar, thinking that there were 2 ways a master could tame a beast in a short time. The first way was for the master to take control by force if the beast was of a lower level than the master. He imagined the tamer towering over the trembling and empty-headed beast, and then thought of the other type of taming, where the animal itself agreed or even wanted to be tamed by the master. He imagined this type of connection as well, and noted that at this point, the beast looking for treasure fell into the second category. He smiled, looking at how it happily embraced the treasure it had found. For 3 days, the protagonist racked his brains over how to tame the new beast, and they went on a treasure hunt in the tea house and ate all sorts of delicious food. Hung even acted as the beast's mother and told the beast a bedtime story, lying next to it in bed. Of course, it was not that simple, and Hung used a trick and deceived the beast, saying that after finding these treasures, it could collect all of them in one place. Now the dragon treated it like an angel, and couldn't wait for Hung to take it to himself. The beast looked at the protagonist with sincere admiration, but Hung trained it like a dog, training in the training ground in the backyard of Hung's house. In order to speed up its dependence on himself, the protagonist also trained the speed of the treasure-seeking beast, and every day he set aside time to train the beast in the training ground in the backyard of the management committee building, so that the lizard could train the treasure-seeking beast. The lizard, roaring furiously, flew, trying to catch up with the beast, who ran away with his eyes closed in fear. The lizard was still faster than the beast, and frowning in concentration, it once again caught up with the dragon, pressing it to the ground with its paw. The monster burst into tears, unable to do anything, and the protagonist held his chin with his hand, watching what was happening, and when the beast was being mistreated, he, like an angel, intervened and stopped Lizard's violence. Once again, he stretched out his hand forward, ordering it to stop, and Lizard looked at him in bewilderment, shuddering, while Hung, frowning, seriously ordered it to let go of the treasure hunter, asking why it was mocking it again. He was unhappy that the dragon could not calm down, and Lizard, covered in sweat from excitement, still looked at him uncertainly, since he himself just recently told it to chase the beast. However, Lizard finally raised his paw, and the beast, jumping to its feet, ran forward, and the rescue of the treasure hunter from the dragon's claws caused the beast to grow a storm of trust and gratitude towards Hang. Still crying, the beast ran up to him, screaming desperately, and smiling, the protagonist asked that it not cry, but calm down, and promising that he would accept it and listen to it. Lizard, standing a little to the side, narrowed his eyes, looking at them sadly, but thanks to Hang's actions, his plan came to fruition. Some time later, they arrived at the edge of the grizzly forest by car, and eventually the car stopped, and Chin, getting out of the car with him and Han, said, "If the protagonist crosses this river, he will cross the outer boundary of the grizzly forest and reach the inner boundary, and there will be a person who will pick him up." Hung smiled and frowned decisively, thanking Ching for this information, but before he could walk across the bridge over the river, suddenly a huge monster ran forward and jumped up, jumping from one bank to the other, and Chang and Hung, noticing this, flinched, and the tiger landed on the ground in front of them. Hei Ju, sitting on the back of a particularly dangerous red fire tiger, smiled as she looked at Hung and guessed that it was him, and then told him her name, noting that she was the master of the grizzly forest, and telling him what he could call her. Chang and Han, placing their palms on their temples, frowned seriously, greeting her, and Hung, smiling affably, waved his hand greeting her as well. Ju, jumping off the tiger's back, said that the mayor had already informed them through the communicator that Hung was arriving in the grizzly forest for a month's training. She thought that he should have arrived a long time ago, but she admitted that she did not expect him to arrive until today. Hung, closing his eyes, apologized for the forced delay and grabbed his hair with his hand, and Ju, coming closer to him, said that Chang and Han could go back, but before leaving, Chang asked what to do with the luggage. Ju, touching the pendant hanging on her neck with her palm, told the monkey to come out and smiled, and the next moment a huge monster appeared behind her back, and Hung, noticing this, even shuddered in surprise, learning that it was a silver-backed gibbon, a very dangerous species. He put his hand on his chin, frowned and remembered that this beast was at least up to the full stage, and from its appearance it was hard to tell whether its power had broken through the shackles of the race, and whether it had advanced further. Ju, meanwhile, waved her hand, attracting the monster's attention, ordering it to deliver the things to the base. The monkey nodded, and Ching, pointing to the car, asked it to come here. Ju at this moment jumped on the tiger's back, noting that the base was still far away, and asked if Hung wanted to ride her tiger there. The protagonist thanked her for this offer, but he still had to refuse, since he was going to fly the lizard. He shrugged, and then, stretching his hand up, told the snake dragon to come out. Lizard appeared behind him, and Ju shuddered, and then, slightly opening her mouth in amazement, covered it with her hand, shocked to note that Hung really is worthy of being his disciple, since his first beast is a supreme dangerous species. She soon controlled her emotions and, smiling, offered to see what Hung is capable of, and warned that riding and fighting are two completely different things, rushing forward on the back of her tiger. The protagonist, climbing on the back of Lizard, said that they need to catch up with Ju, and pointed a finger in her direction, frowning in concentration. Lizard's eyes shone, it frowned in concentration, and then began to emit magical energy from itself, and noticing the aura that appeared around, Hung was horrified, shuddering, and asked what Lizard was going to do. The next moment, the lizard ran forward so fast that the protagonist could hardly stay on its back and closed his eyes, clenching his jaws. He screamed, and the lizard, spreading its wings, rose into the air, and Heng admitted that Ju was right in asking the lizard to stop and not hurry so much. Some time later, they reached the desired place and, getting off their animals, approached a large door, near which Ju stopped and knocked, seriously ordering the guard to quickly open it for them. Shuiyu, slightly opening a small window on the door, smiled and asked if Ju could not be a little more feminine. He said that because of her, the gate was collapsing, but in the end he opened the door, and then, closing his eyes, asked if she could not take the key with her next time? He said that he was already busy and complained that he still had to open the gate for her. Crossing her arms over her chest, Ju looked at him with displeasure and frowned, asking if he was busy. She assumed he was busy hibernating, and asked how dare he sneak into the base to hide and rest while the commander was away. Yu awkwardly grabbed his hair, admitting that he had made a mistake, and announced that he was ready to open the gate for Ju. She did not respond, but simply hit him on the head, and Yu screamed, closing his eyes, tears forming in the corners. Ju, meanwhile, pointed to the side, ordering him to go and take care of Heng's luggage and accommodation. The protagonist smiled excitedly, closing his eyes, and noticed the strange way of communication that Ju used. He was not able to think about it for long, as she told him that currently only she and Yu were in the grizzly forest at the base, and noted that initially there were several sergeants in the squad who did menial work, but later these sergeants could not stand the harsh conditions and applied for transfer. The work was entrusted to their pets, and Ju smiled and also told them that the head of the grizzly forest base and the main master of the base, Lord Suku, had gone to hunt down a dangerous creature in the Grey Wasteland and left a few days ago. Another master, Linjin, was waiting for Hung to arrive at the base, intending to take him along for part of the special master training, but they didn't know that he was a few days late, so Jin started by himself. The protagonist froze in shock upon hearing this, and then awkwardly grabbed his hair, closed his eyes, and admitted that he himself didn't expect that he would be late. But Ju said that everything was fine, and suggested that they go to her room first. Hung shuddered upon hearing this suggestion, and froze with his eyes wide open, but soon followed Ju, and they found themselves in a room with heads of destroyed animals hanging on the wall. While Hung was looking at the stuffed animals with a shocked frown, Ju sat on the bed, watching him with a smile, and finally, dissatisfied with his long distraction, she called out to him, asking him to turn around, and asked if he was an idiot. The protagonist, however, turned towards her, closed his eyes, saying that he was not an idiot, and admitted that the decor was just a little unusual. Ju, smiling slightly, asked if he thought she was the maid here who did nothing but clean. Finally, distracted from this topic, she patted the bed next to her with her palm and asked why Hing didn't sit down. He flinched, astonished by this suggestion, and began waving his arms, trying to refuse it, and noticing his embarrassment, Ju laughed, deciding that she would not tease him. She guessed that he didn't know about the special training program for masters in the grizzly forest before coming here, and she said after getting up from the bed that this could also be considered a rule. Usually, when their masters with black light received their first special training, they were only informed of the specific contents of it after arriving at the base in the grizzly forest. The special training was not only to hone their combat experience, but also the benefits that came with it, and Ju smiled and admitted that she didn't know if Hung had heard of energy fruits. The protagonist shuddered in shock, asking if there were energy fruits in this grizzly forest. Ju said that it was naturally so, explaining that the grizzly forest was rich in bear fruits, which were energy fruits that their blacklight castle used very often. These fruits increased the strength, endurance of dangerous creatures, and were also useful for evil, beast-like, and attack pets. Stepping aside a bit, she pulled the curtains, revealing a map hanging on the wall, and pointing it out to Hing, she warned that getting such fruits was not so easy, since all the trees with this fruit in the grizzly forest were occupied by warrior bears. With a token received from the owner of the grizzly forest, the grizzly chief, the master tamer could challenge the owner of a certain fruit tree, and with the token, these grizzlies usually did not refuse to fight, and after defeating them, you could get the bear fruit. Hung listened to this, frozen in amazement, and Ju suddenly became serious and, frowning, said that if someone who was not associated with Castle Blacklight dared to steal the fruit, all the grizzlies and even their masters would definitely attack him, and they would chase the thief until he died. Some time later, a loud cry was heard in the forest as the grizzly frowned and looked at the lizard standing in front of it. Jin, who was sitting on a tree branch next to Hing, noticed that the grizzly was ready to accept the challenge and explained that if the lizard could defeat his opponent, the bare fruit of the fruit tree that was over 30 years old would end up in his hands. Hung, looking at the lizard excitedly, sighed, admitting that he did not think it was that simple. Jin slightly bowed his head and explained that each grizzly would only accept a challenge from an opponent whose aura he thought was weaker than his own, and naturally, there would be risks involved in getting the bear fruit. Meanwhile, the grizzly activated its bear roar and opened its mouth, growling loudly, and gusts of wind were directed towards the lizard, who frowned in concentration, looking at the enemy, and then suddenly shuddered, becoming less angry, since the attack launched by the grizzly did not bring any damage to it. Noticing the behavior of the lizard, the bear froze, angry, and the protagonist, worried, thought that he did not even expect that the lizard had the talent to mock. Sitting down on a branch, he called out to Jin and, frowning, asked if it was true that the grizzly accepted the challenge. He said that it was indeed so, explaining that the lizard simply did not deal with this dangerous kind of animal, so it might be very difficult for him. He pointed his hand towards the beasts, and the next moment, the grizzly and the dragon ran forward, preparing to attack each other. During the movement, Lizard activated the power of the dragon, and a magical aura immediately appeared around it, so that by the time Lizard and the bear collided, Lizard was able to stop the bear's paws that were about to strike it. However, the bear quickly got its bearings and, breaking free from this grip, swung its paw, striking Lizard, and it, closing its eyes, flew far back. The grizzly, taking advantage of the fact that Lizard fell, came closer, hanging over it, and Lizard flinched, and noticing this, Jin frowned, crying out, as he realized that Lizard was in danger. He stood up, intending to go to its aid. However, Hung, stretching out his hand in front of him, stopped him and asked him to wait a little, as he thought Lizard needed to gain experience. He smiled confidently, and Lizard, frowning, activated suppression, which caused the bear to freeze, trembling, and Lizard managed to get up. Very soon, the grizzly had already escaped the effect of the magic of this, but by the time it struck, Lizard had recovered and managed to jump to the side, avoiding the attack. The bear looked after it furiously, and Lizard, changing the direction of movement, raised his paw, activating the power of the dragon of strengthening. Jumping back, the dragon rose into the air, putting forward a paw, which was surrounded by magical energy due to strengthening, and struck with it, which caused several deep scratches on the bear's shoulder. Without stopping, Lizard flew to the side, and the bear looked after it furiously, and Jin, who was watching the fight, relaxed, noticing that Hung had trained Lizard well, and this one had already developed an instinct to strike after strike. It was a rare thing, but the desire to break through the grizzly's defense was not enough, as strength was also needed. The protagonist admitted that the grizzly's defense was truly incredible, and Jin explained that this was the effect of the bear fruit, reminding that if Lizard won, he would receive this. Hung, in order to encourage Lizard, began to shout, telling it to attack, and the dragon became slightly nervous, and the bear at this time, taking advantage of the pause in the battle, activated beast healing, and the wound on its shoulder was healed. Noticing this, Lizard frowned, activating the breath of evil thoughts, the balm of evil thoughts, and opened its mouth, concentrating a cloud of magical energy near it. Lizard rose into the air, directed this projectile towards the grizzly, and when the magic collided with the bear's body, an explosion occurred, dust and smoke rose into the air, due to which nothing could be seen for a while. However, when the dust cleared, Lizard and the others noticed that there was not a single scratch on the bear, and the tree behind this one was damaged. The bear picked up one of the fallen tree parts, and raised it above his head, using it as a weapon. Swinging, the grizzly threw this thick branch forward, and without stopping, also threw several more parts. Noticing this, Lizard shuddered, and began to jump to the side, dodging attacks, and the broken trees thrown by the grizzly, meanwhile, stood in front of him in a dense wall, not allowing him to pass, and Lizard shuddered, and then, sweating from the strain, turned, doomly looking at the grizzly, who came closer to him and growled threateningly. Jin let out a startled cry, noticing that the bear had grown even larger, and explained that this was a natural skill, a berserker attack, realizing that this grizzly had initially pretended that it was weak. Still frowning excitedly, he looked at him, telling him that this technique was not something that every bear could master, and after using it, one could instantly increase one's own strength and defense. He understood that the current Lizard was unable to defeat an opponent of such strength, so he said that it was time to end this test. Hung was silent for a while, thinking, and then said that up until now, he had not received any calls for help from the Lizard in the spiritual world, and so he believed in it and clenched his fist, watching the battle unwaveringly. Lizard, cornered, began to look around excitedly, and the grizzly, coming closer to it, swung its paw to strike, and at the same moment, Lizard, frowning, activated an angry attack second speed, and when the bear struck, it flew to the side, and the trees that had previously formed a wall flew apart due to the force of the bear's strike. Dodging the blow, Lizard sank to the ground, but despite the successful maneuver, Jin still shouted that at such a speed, Lizard would not be able to brush off the bear and would be hit. Grizzly at that moment used a bear throw to drive Lizard away, and watching the bear running towards this, Lizard suddenly thought of something and waved its tail, lowering the end of it to the ground, and then activated the second stage of the earth dance. Stone spears began to emerge from the ground, heading towards the grizzly, and upon reaching the bear, these stones blocked the grizzly's path, slightly pushing it back. The grizzly was unable to stay on its feet and fell, rolling to the side and crashing into the trunk of a nearby tree. Lizard smiled contentedly, noticing this, and closing his eyes, walked closer to the defeated bear, and Jin, smiling enthusiastically, called the bear stupid, asking why Lizard did not defeat it earlier. Hung said that it was just luck and began to wave his palm, and Jin suddenly noticed that he was hanging on a tree branch, holding on with one hand, and apologized to him, admitting that he forgot that he did not have enough spiritual energy to stay in the air right now. He brought his fingers to his mouth and whistled, calling for a flying pet blood-tailed black-billed hawk. The hawk appeared in the air, flying closer to the protagonist, and placing its paws on his shoulders, the monster flew into the air, gently lowering him to the ground. Hung was surprised, and after the hawk flew away, Jin, landing next to the protagonist, confidently said that he was his best disciple, suggesting that he had done a good job with the snake dragon in today's battle. He extended his hand forward, commanding the Lotus Hatter to come out, and the Lotus Hatter, which was a grass-type medicinal animal that rooted in the soil to absorb nutrients, appeared in front of him, shrouded in magical energy. He explained that one of the rules for summoning a grizzly in the forest was that after the battle was over, the bear's wounds had to be healed, otherwise they would be attacked by the bears. Lotus began to heal the bear at this time, and Hunt, smiling, grabbed his hair with his hand, thanking Jin for helping. He crossed his arms over his chest, declaring that it was easy, and the grizzly, whose wounds were healed, opened his eyes slightly, noticing the smiling lizard and the Hatter's lotus in front of him. Abruptly jumping to his feet, the grizzly frowned angrily, but suddenly Jin appeared in front of it, and, holding out his palm forward, warned that if it wanted to fight again, this one would have to add another fruit. The bear froze, continuing to frown, but less furiously, and in the end, just sighing, the grizzly walked away, hanging his head in disappointment. Hung, watching this, pointed his finger to the side, noticing that it just walked away, and he asked, "Where is the fruit?" Jin smiled, and then told him to follow him, promising that in that case he would see everything. Together they followed the bear and soon found themselves near the desired tree, and noticing this, Lizard came closer to it together with the grizzly, who, carefully taking one of the fruits with his teeth, tore it off the tree and, closing his eyes, laid it on the ground. The lizard frowned at the drool-covered fruit and froze, sweating from disgust, but nevertheless approached the fruit, although he did not take it in his teeth, but began to roll it with his paws. Grizzly, watching this, laughed, and Jin, some time later, when he noticed that Lizard, who had nevertheless taken the fruit in his teeth, came out from behind the trees, noted that Jews should have mentioned to him that each grizzly bear guarding the territory will have a small tree growing that bears fruit, and asked if this was true. He explained that right in the center of the bear's den is the main treasure of this forest, and when Lizard came closer, it, squinting its eyes, spat out the fruit, throwing it into the hands of Hun, who was surprised, asking if this was really a bear fruit. It turned out to be less than he thought, and then, distracted from his surprise, the protagonist looked at Jin and asked how to use it. He explained that the pet simply needed to eat it, telling that after collecting the mysterious energy contained in the fruits, after a few minutes, it begins to evaporate, and the sooner Lizard ate it, the better, especially since they do not have special items for preserving the fruit. He even envied Hun a little, who at that moment, approaching Lizard, waved his hand towards the fruit, telling it to eat. Lizard screamed, looking at the fruit with horror, and froze, squinting his eyes and covered in sweat from excitement, when he remembered how the grizzly gave this fruit to it. Clenching his jaws tighter, Lizard turned away, frowning, and noticing this, Hun indignantly asked, "What kind of nonsense is this?" He didn't like the expression on Lizard's face, and exclaimed that it was a good thing. Finally guessing what could be the reason for Lizard's behavior, Hun turned to Jin and asked if he had any water. Jin smiled mockingly and asked if the protagonist was going to cut up the fruit later. They washed the fruit after all and threw it to Lizard. The protagonist closed his eyes in a bit of annoyance, and told it to eat. Lizard caught the fruit in midair and chewed it, and Jin put his hand on his chin and told Hun to get ready, suggesting that Lizard absorb the bear fruit here and said that they would leave after it absorbed the energy of the bear fruit. He explained that otherwise it would cause a lot of energy loss, and Heng scratched his head in confusion and asked if that was really the case. Jin extended his palm forward and ordered the lion and python to come out, and Hung looked in surprise at the mature dangerous species rockweb python and the mature dangerous species king of beasts lion that appeared. Jin ordered the pets to guard the area, and the protagonist froze, excitedly watching as the python and lion began to move a little to the side to carry out the order, and then thought that it would take a little more effort to absorb the bear fruit. Looking towards Jin, he smiled, thanking him for his help and protection, and he waved his hand and said that he was always ready to help him, explaining that the fruit cannot be preserved in any way, so after collecting it, it usually needs to be taken and digested in the dense forest before returning to the base. Focusing on the lizard that had laid down on the ground in the middle of the magic circle that had appeared, as well as the lion and python that had started to walk around, ready to fend off any danger, Jin then continued to explain, noting that if one did not have a strong enough companion animal, it was best to stay in hidden and safe places such as caves or trees. He also noted that after a few times, Hung would get used to it, and the lizard suddenly frowned, and noticing this, Hung attracted Jin's attention, wanting to say something, but guessing what he wanted to say, Jin explained that the mysterious energy of the fruit would transform the body and cells of living beings at an extraordinary speed, so that the body would be able to produce a stress response, and in the end, this is how the effect of the fruit is revealed. He frowned seriously as he said this, so that Hung would not doubt his words, and Lizard suddenly stood up, its body began to change, and it raised its head and roared. It had been 13 days since Lizard ate the first bear fruit, and in these 13 days, the dragon had not only grown in size, but had also approached the beginning of adulthood, and in strength, endurance, and physical ability, it was no weaker than a late-stage snake dragon, and in terms of cultivation, it even surpassed a late-stage snake dragon. After all, in the past 10 days, it had eaten 8 or 9 bear fruits. Lizard was born with the talent of mockery and provocation, and its success in fighting grizzlies was such that even Jin was shocked and ashamed. He frowned in amazement when, after another battle, Lizard extended his fist forward with a smile, and Hung, also smiling happily, lightly hit the lizard's paw with his fist. In 13 days, Lizard had fought almost 10 grizzlies that had occupied the bear fruit trees, and the winning percentage of this one was almost 70%, except for the first day, when Lizard took a risk and defeated that stupid bear. The reason for the high success rate after that was the hero standing behind the scenes, namely, the beast seeking treasure. During another journey deep in the forest, Hung patted the beast on the head, and soon it, frowning in concentration, pointed a finger of its paw forward, choosing the bear. Almost all the bears that Lizard had challenged were chosen by this beast, and Jin had only been able to collect 1 bear fruit during this time. The treasure-seeking beast was the real reason why the lizard was able to collect so many fruits, and this was a secret that Jin couldn't guess yet. At this moment, the protagonist, riding the lizard, went into the forest again, and it suddenly screamed, and holding his chin with his hand, Hung asked, did it say that it sensed that bear from the first day that knew the berserker attack technique again? The lizard nodded, and Hung suggested going to meet it, and with a jump, the lizard flew, heading towards the right place. Hiding behind the bushes, Hung slightly parted the branches, wondering to himself, was this really a battle again? He looked at the monster that jumped on the bear, clinging to its body with its fangs, and learned that it was an armored wolf, a dangerous mid-level species that usually lived in dark caves and mines. The forest was a foreign area for this, and Hung realized that in this case, this wolf must be a pet. The man in charge of it admitted that he underestimated the bear, and noted that the armored wolf was not an opponent for this, and then, stretching out his hand forward, ordered the heavily armored wolf to come out and finish off this bear. Hung shuddered, paying attention to the man, and mentally repeated the name of the heavily armored wolf, recalling that this was the evolution of the armored wolf, which had virtually no weak points in the first echelon of the most dangerous species. It was comparable to a weak dangerous species of the highest level, and was much stronger than the fire tiger Ju. The wolf, surrounded by magical energy, almost immediately after appearing, went on the attack, and when it passed by the bushes where Hung and Lizard were sitting, the protagonist noted that looking at the body of this wolf, one can understand that the level of this is perfect, and the beast itself is very strong. The wolf, pushing off the ground, began to run and crashed head-on into the grizzly, throwing it aside. Blood splashed out of the grizzly's mouth, and the bear itself fell into the nearby water. Lizard and Hung were amazed that the wolf defeated the grizzly so easily, and the protagonist remembered that Hwanga once said that the Blacklight Castle was created hundreds of years ago, and in the process of its development, the members of this castle were naturally forced to fight and even enter into military conflicts, which means that they made enemies. He imagined several people hiding their faces with masks and put his hand to his chin, noting that the powerful rival force was comparable to Blacklight, and seemed to have a large number of masters who could control these armored wolves and heavily armored wolves, since they controlled the habitat of the armored wolves, just like Blacklight controlled the grizzly forest, and they had the same situation. It was just not as big as the grizzly forest. He imagined the forest where the armored wolves lived, and noticed that now these people appeared in the grizzly forest and actually came for the fruits. He didn't understand how he could save that bear, since even Blacklight couldn't figure out how to preserve the fruits. He watched excitedly as the man and this one's pet approached the tree with the bear fruits. Stopping next to it, the man took out a syringe and, moving the needle into one of the bear fruits, he began to draw juice from it, and Hung froze in shock, watching this, and then suddenly noticed a monster hovering in the air above him, and cursed, realizing that it was a scout. He frowned, and Lizard next to him threateningly opened his mouth, looking at a possible rival. The guy had only managed to collect juice from one fruit by this point when he heard his assistant scream and shuddered, frowning, and then angrily noted that he hadn't known there was someone hiding there. He didn't understand what kind of nonsense it was, and hiding the syringe in the bag hanging on his belt, he offered his wolf to look at who was there and jumped on the wolf's back. The wolf ran through the forest in big leaps, and a few minutes later Hung appeared in his field of vision, sitting on the back of the running lizard. Turning back, he frowned in concentration, pressing his lips tighter, and noted that it was possible to escape from a heavily armored wolf of a particularly dangerous type, deciding that he needed to penetrate the forest, hide his identity, and set all the grizzlies on this guy. But he took out the radio that was hanging in the bag on his belt and announced that he had found the poacher, asking for someone to send reinforcements. He also asked the people to hurry up, but suddenly froze in horror, noticing that the radio was dead, and asked himself, was that really true? He remembered that he had indeed lived quietly for a long time and had not charged this radio, and besides, there were always people nearby. Cursing, he decided that no matter how hard it was, he would spread the news about this poacher, and he frowned stubbornly. While Lizard continued to run, already rising into the air, Hung called the beast seeking treasure, and it landed on his shoulder, and the wolf continued to pursue them. The dragon activated magical energy to speed up, and noticing this, the poacher looked at the protagonist, and then stretched out his palm forward, commanding the heavily armored wolf to use its skills, catch up and kill Hung and Lizard. The wolf stopped, looking back, and then used the fifth stage of the evil attack of the Shadow Tread, greatly increasing its speed. The protagonist and Lizard turned around and were horrified, noticing that the wolf was already catching up, and frowning. Hung told Lizard to use the evil attack of the second speed and remember that they need to head towards the giant trees. Lizard roared and spread its wings wider, and although the acceleration and sustained effect of the evil attack of the second speed were not as good as that of the Shadow Tread, however, the advantage of the speed attack was that it could change direction unlike the Shadow Tread. Since the wolf could not change direction, Hung thought that it would have great fun crashing into the trees. In this manner, they moved quickly through the forest, and Hung, smiling slightly, decided that it would be better to lure the poacher to Jin. The wolf, once again unable to change direction, crashed into a tree, breaking it, and the poacher shouted that the protagonist really knew how to run away, but then summoned another beast, which turned out to be a thunder tiger with 3 attributes. This was the most dangerous species, and leaving the wolf behind, the poacher jumped onto the tiger to continue the pursuit, this time on its back. He extended his hand forward, giving the tiger an order, and it rushed forward, catching up with him quite quickly. Leaping into the air, the tiger used a thunderclaw attack. However, Lizard managed to dodge this attack, although he received a small injury. The protagonist frowned, realizing that this was an especially dangerous species, a thunder tiger, which was definitely in its prime. The beast sitting on his shoulder closed its eyes in excitement, and Hung, putting his palm on Lizard's wound, realized that at this rate, even if the tiger did not catch up with them, it would kill them. Suddenly, he opened his eyes wider, thinking of something, and asked the treasure hunter to take them to the nearest territory of the bear leader. Nodding, the beast closed its eyes, and Hung suggested that his pets act, since they needed help. Lizard turned sharply, turning into a canyon, and the protagonist, attracting its attention, said that the dragon should not just run away, but use the dance of the earth to try to kill the pursuers. At this time, the beast closed its eyes, using its magic, and Lizard growled, and stone spikes began to appear behind it, blocking the path of the wolf and the tiger. The poacher ordered the heavy armored wolf to clear the way and extended his finger forward, directing the monster to run, breaking through the stone spikes with its body. The poacher then ran along the cleared way on top of the tiger, and looking at Hung, he asked smugly, did he really think that he could escape? Hearing the stranger's voice, and also noticing the stone fragments flying into the air, Hung frowned, turned around, and looked at the pursuer. The poacher and the tiger suddenly stopped, as the guy noticed that Hung had disappeared, and ordered the thunder tiger to find him. The tiger roared, and then sniffed the air, shuddered in horror, sweated with excitement, and trembled slightly. The poacher, noticing this behavior of his pet, looked at it with bewilderment, and, attracting the tiger's attention, asked what happened. Looking in the direction the monster was looking, he noticed the glowing eyes of a beast in a cave near where they were standing, and was so shocked that he could not even form a sentence, but guessed what exactly could be hiding inside the cave. The next moment, with a thundering tread of paws, a huge bear came out of the cave, who, frowning in fury, growled, and the poacher was horrified, cursing, because he realized that it was the leader of the grizzly. Turning the tiger, he ordered it to run away, and the animal, looking at the grizzly with horror, began to run to the side, while the bear chased them, opening his mouth and showing terrible fangs. Hung and Lizard, who had moved a little to the side, froze when they heard the screams, and the protagonist thought that the leader could call the pack to attack this. But it didn't even call anyone, and he realized that even if that poacher was strong, he couldn't handle all the bears. He frowned, looking in the direction where the screams were coming from, and then, sitting more comfortably on Lizard, he suggested that they return to the base, because if they were late, it was unknown how many fruits would be stolen from the grizzly forest. Lizard, starting to move forward, accelerated, and then, jumping up, began to fly, using an evil attack, a speed attack. Soon they began to descend to the ground, but Heng shuddered in horror, opening his eyes wider, as he noticed a magic projectile flying in their direction. He ordered Lizard to quickly jump, and it bounced off the ground and rose into the air, and the next moment, the projectile that hit the place where they were standing exploded upon contact with the ground. Lizard jumped onto the branch of the closest tree, and the guy who came closer said with regret that Hung was lucky and dodged. He called him a name, and the protagonist shuddered, looking at the poacher, and clenched his jaw, asking how he found him. Shrugging, the guy called Hung a name again, explaining that his Thunder Tiger had a skill called Star Mantle. That's why he could find him even if he was 10 times further away, and the protagonist got angry thinking about this skill, while the poacher continued to speak, smirked, and noted that Heng's tactics were clever, recalling that he wanted the grizzly chief to hold the poacher back while he tried to escape back. However, the guy also warned that Heng should know that it was easy for a master of his level to escape from a stupid bear. Unlike the protagonist, he was able to use a scaly lizard as a pet, and pointing towards Heng and Lizard, the guy ordered the Thunder Tiger to kill them. The tiger jumped up, appearing in the air in front of Lizard and Heng, but suddenly it froze, its eyes wide in fear, as they used the evil attack of the second stage of enlightenment. Because of this, the dragon seemed to be a weaker species, but when Lizard used a different type of attack, its true appearance became clearer. Heng smiled and thought, if they used the mystical gift of the treasure-seeking beast, namely illusion, the poacher would mistake the snake dragon for an ordinary scaly lizard, and then suddenly the dragon's power would burst out, and although it would not be able to scare away the poacher and his pets, it would be enough to buy time. He mentally imagined the outline of his plan, and then was glad that he had managed to make a smoke screen from the waste from the secretion of black fat, and now it came in handy. Clenching his jaw, he frowned, swung the hand in which he was clutching a small bomb, and when he threw it, and the bomb collided with an obstacle, it exploded, blocking the view of everything with a bright flash of light and smoke. Sometime later,